There is something in the boreal forest that does not belong to the trees. You would not find it by looking up. The canopy closes above you, like a cathedral ceiling, dense and green and ancient, filtering the light into something pale and diffuse. You would not find it by listening, because the forest swallows sound the way it swallows everything else, softly, without ceremony, without leaving a mark. You would find it by looking down, by paying attention to the way the ground rises in a line that is too straight, or the way a stone sits in the soil at an angle that gravity would not have chosen. You would find it the way the surveyors found it, accidentally, when they were looking for something else entirely, and then stood very still for a long moment before writing their notes in careful, neutral language, because there was no other language for what they were looking at. Canada's boreal forest covers nearly 3 million square kilometers. It stretches from Newfoundland in the east to the Yukon in the west, from the northern edges of the settled provinces all the way to the Arctic tree line. It is the second largest biome on Earth. It is also, by almost every measure of archaeological investigation, among the least examined landscapes in the world, not because nothing is there, but because the canopy makes aerial survey nearly impossible, and the permafrost and peat make ground survey brutal, and the sheer scale of the place makes systematic investigation something that has, in practical terms, barely begun. What that means is that what we know is almost certainly a fraction of what exists. And what exists, based on what surveyors and foresters and pipeline crews and geologists have stumbled into over the last 150 years, is something that does not fit any model of pre-Columbian Canadian history that has ever been officially approved. These are not the mounds of the Ohio Valley, which have at least been partially studied. They are not the cliff dwellings of the American Southwest, which are visible and famous and catalogued. They are stone structures in the deep forest, stone roads that no one built, stone enclosures on mountain summits that no one climbed, as far as the official record is concerned, stone platforms under the root systems of trees that are themselves 400 years old, which means the structures beneath them are older than that by a margin that no one has been willing to formally address. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now, and what time is it. The story begins, as these stories often do, not with an excavation, but with an accident. In the summer of 1907, a survey team working for the Dominion Land Survey was mapping the border region between what was then the Northwest Territories and the newly formed province of Saskatchewan. The team was led by a surveyor named George Oldcroft, and his field notes, which survive in the Library and Archives Canada collection under a reference number that requires a specific written access request to locate, describe what the team found on the third day of their traverse through the boreal forest north of the Pasquia Hills. They had been following a bearing line through dense spruce forest when the lead chainman, a man named Reuben Cross, stopped and called back to Oldcroft that the ground was wrong. Oldcroft came forward and found that they were standing on a surface that was not natural ground. Under approximately 30 centimeters of accumulated needle duff and organic material, the chainman had exposed, with the tip of his survey rod, a surface of fitted stone. The stones were not large, none of them more than 40 or 50 centimeters on a side, but they were fitted together without mortar in a manner that Oldcroft, in his field notes, described as being as precise as any dressed stonework he had seen in a building. The surface extended in both directions along the bearing line, and when they cleared a longer section, they found that it was approximately 2 meters wide and ran in a direction that was, Oldcroft noted with careful understatement, not the direction of any natural geological feature he could account for. They followed it for as long as their schedule permitted, which was about 400 meters. In that distance, the surface did not deviate from its bearing. It did not narrow or widen. It did not end. They simply ran out of time and left it there in the forest, covered it back over with the duff they had displaced, and Oldcroft noted in his report that the feature was of possible archaeological interest and that it should be brought to the attention of the appropriate authorities. There is no record that the appropriate authorities were ever notified or that anyone ever returned. The survey notes were filed, they sat in the archive, and the stone road, if that is what it was, sat in the forest under its 30 centimeters of accumulated years, waiting. That particular account is unusual, only in that it was written down in a context where the document was preserved. The oral record among the Cree and Ojibwe communities, whose traditional territories overlap with that region of the boreal forest, contains dozens of references to what their elders described as the old paths, the roads that the first people made, the ways through the forest that were there when their own ancestors arrived. The woodland Cree tradition speaks of these paths in a very specific way, not as constructed roads in the European sense, but as intentional modifications to the landscape that guided movement without requiring continuous visible presence. You would follow a path, and then the path would be underground, and you would find it again 100 steps further on, because you knew how to look. That is a description that matches, almost precisely, what archaeologists studying pre-contact indigenous travel routes in the eastern boreal forest have been documenting since the 1980s, when the first systematic surveys of old-growth forest floor features began producing results that defied easy categorization. The paths were intermittent. They were not roads in any familiar sense. They were something older than the concept of a road, something that assumed a different relationship between the traveler and the landscape, a relationship in which the land itself was a partner in the journey, rather than an obstacle to be overcome. And then there were the features that did not fit even that model, the features that were not paths at all, but structures, enclosures, platforms, things that had been built carefully and deliberately for a purpose that no one had yet been willing to formally propose. In 1961, a timber cruiser working for a forestry company in northwestern Ontario, in the Kenora district, was assessing old-growth white spruce in an area that had never been logged. His name was Frank Delaney, and his account survives in a collection of retired forestry company records that were donated to the Thunder Bay Public Library in the 1990s and have since been partially digitized, though the relevant portion is in an index card reference system that does not appear in the online catalogue. Delaney was walking a grid survey through the old growth when he encountered what he initially took to be a natural rock outcropping. It was only when he began to move around it, checking his compass bearing and noting the elevation change, that he realized the feature was not natural. It was a platform, roughly rectangular, perhaps 15 meters on its longer axis and 8 meters on the shorter, elevated perhaps 1.5 meters above the surrounding forest floor. The elevation was achieved by means of fitted stone construction, dry-laid courses of granite that had been shaped, not to the precise tolerance of ashlar masonry, but shaped nonetheless. Their faces worked to a roughness that was consistent and deliberate. The top surface was flat, in a way that natural rock outcroppings are not, and it was covered with a thin layer of forest duff over what Delaney, when he cleared a small section, found to be a compacted surface of smaller stones and packed earth. He measured it, he paced it, and recorded the dimensions. He noted that the corners were approximately square. He noted that the long axis was oriented roughly east-west, though he did not record the precise compass bearing. He noted that the nearest similar rock, native granite of the same general type, was exposed in an outcrop approximately 200 meters to the north, and that there was no obvious natural mechanism by which the stone forming the platform could have been transported to its present location. He did not report it to any authority. He was a timber cruiser. It was not his job to report stone structures. He wrote it in his daily log, filed the log with the company at the end of the season, and moved on to the next survey block. The question of who would have built a fitted stone elevated platform in the old-growth forest of northwestern Ontario is a question that, if asked of the academic archaeology community, produces one of three responses. The first response is that the feature, if it exists, is probably natural, a glacially deposited erratic or a frost-heaved bedrock outcrop that Delaney misidentified. The second response is that if it is artificial, it was probably constructed in the historic period by settlers or prospectors or some other non-indigenous actor whose purpose, though unknown, is assumed to have been mundane. The third response, which comes from a smaller number of researchers, is that it is almost certainly indigenous, pre-contact, and representative of a category of site that has never been formally defined or adequately studied because the funding and the will to do so have not existed. The Anishinaabe oral tradition contains specific references to elevated stone platforms, known in some dialects as a term that translates roughly as high places of meeting, which were understood to function as ceremonial spaces, as places of deliberation, and as points from which the relationship between the human community and the surrounding landscape was formally renewed at specific times of year. The Midawewin, the Grand Medicine Society, whose knowledge traditions extend back to a period well before European contact, contains references within its ceremonial teachings to constructed high places that were part of the spiritual infrastructure of the land, features that existed before the Anishinaabe arrived in the Great Lakes region and that were inherited as part of the landscape when they came. That reference, that the high places were there before, is one that appears in enough independent oral accounts, from enough distinct communities, that it cannot easily be dismissed as later interpolation or narrative elaboration. Something was in the forest before the communities who currently remember it were in the forest. The forest hid it, and the forest remembered it, and the communities who lived alongside the forest incorporated the memory of it into their own knowledge systems, which is the most resilient form of preservation that any cultural knowledge can achieve. What makes the Canadian boreal forest uniquely difficult as an archaeological landscape is not just its size, or its canopy cover, or its remoteness, it is the peat. The boreal forest sits, over much of its extent, on a layer of accumulated organic material that in some areas is several meters deep, and that has been accumulating since the last glacial retreat, roughly 10,000 years ago. Peat is an extraordinary preserving medium, and in some contexts, as archaeologists working in European bogs have long understood, it preserves organic materials with remarkable fidelity. But peat also obscures. It buries. It swallows stone structures and wooden structures and earthworks and surfaces beneath an accumulating blanket that thickens by roughly a millimeter a year in most boreal environments and by considerably more in wetter areas. A stone structure that was built 3,000 years ago in a reasonably wet boreal environment might today be buried under 3 meters of peat, invisible from any surface survey, undetectable by any instrument short of ground-penetrating radar, operated by someone who already knows where to look. The implication of this, which has been formally articulated by at least 2 Canadian archaeologists in peer-reviewed publications that received essentially no mainstream attention, is that the apparent absence of pre-contact structures in the boreal forest is almost entirely a function of the preserving and concealing properties of the peat itself. What we see on the surface of the boreal forest is what has been exposed by erosion, by logging, by pipeline construction, by road building, and by the occasional determined field researcher. What lies beneath the peat is unknown, in a way that is genuinely unknown, not the kind of unknown that means probably nothing, but the kind of unknown that means no one has looked. The exceptions to that pattern are the areas where the peat has been removed by natural processes, the exposed hillsides, the rocky uplands where peat does not accumulate, the lakeshores where wave action prevents organic buildup, the ridge crests where drainage and wind keep the surface relatively clear, and it is in precisely these exposed areas, the places where the landscape shows through, that the anomalous stone features tend to appear. In the summer of 1988, a team from the Manitoba Geological Survey was conducting a bedrock mapping project in the Grass River Provincial Park area in northern Manitoba, traversing exposed Precambrian shield outcrops to document the underlying geology. On the second week of the survey, working on a rocky ridge that overlooked a chain of lakes to the north, the team's junior geologist, whose name appears in the survey report only as A. Thibodeau, noted a stone feature that did not appear on any existing map or survey and that was inconsistent with any natural geological process she could identify. The feature was a wall. It was approximately 30 meters long, constructed of fitted granite blocks, some of them quite large, perhaps half a meter thick and a meter long, laid in courses with what the survey report describes as deliberate interlocking. The wall was not vertical, it leaned slightly into the hillside, suggesting that it was either constructed at a slight batter or that it had shifted slightly over time. But it was clearly a wall, in the sense that it was a linear structure of fitted stone that had been assembled by someone with intention and skill. Its height, where best preserved, was approximately 1.5 meters. At either end, it turned, forming the suggestion of corners, but the terminal sections were too disturbed by frost action and tree root intrusion to determine whether the wall had formed part of a complete enclosure or merely a long linear barrier. Thibodeau's report note was included in the Manitoba Geological Survey report for that season, filed under geological features of possible non-geological origin and referred to the Manitoba Historic Sites and Monuments branch for follow-up. There is a single letter in the archive from the Historic Sites branch acknowledging receipt of the referral and indicating that it would be reviewed. There is no record of any subsequent action. The wall sits on its ridge in Grass River Provincial Park today, presumably still there, presumably still fitted and standing to roughly its 1,988 height, covered in lichen and moss and overshadowed by spruce. You could walk past it in the forest and, if you did not know what to look for, you might take it for a natural rock formation. That is, after all, how it survived. The question of how old it is has never been formally addressed. Lichen growth rates on exposed granite in northern Manitoba suggest that lichen colonies of the size and type covering the wall's stones would require a minimum of several centuries to develop to their current extent, and possibly much longer, depending on site-specific variables. That is not a date, it is a minimum age. The wall is at least several centuries old. How many more centuries beyond that, no one has established, because no one has tried. The Woodland Cree communities, whose traditional territory includes the Grass River area, have a term for features of this type, which translates approximately as the old enclosures, and their oral tradition holds that these enclosures were not built by their own ancestors, but were found by their ancestors when they arrived in the region, already old, already covered in the lichen that signals great age, already so fully incorporated into the landscape that the boundary between the human-made and the natural had become indistinct. The enclosures were, in the Cree understanding, gifts from the land, features that the land had accepted over so long a period that they had become part of the land, and therefore part of the knowledge system of anyone who lived in right relationship with that land. That is a very different way of saying the same thing the geologist said in her field notes. Something is here. It did not come from the geology. It is old enough that the boundary between it and the natural world is blurred, and no one is entirely sure what to do with it. The forested uplands of New Brunswick, on the Bay of Fundy side, have a particular quality that is relevant to this discussion. The Fundy coast is famous for its tides, the highest tides in the world, 50 or 60 feet of water moving in and out twice a day, sculpting the coastline in ways that have made the intertidal zone one of the most intensively modified landscapes anywhere in eastern Canada. The Mi'kmaq, who have lived on this coast for thousands of years, were and remain highly sophisticated managers of the tidal environment. Their fish weirs, the stone V-shaped traps built in the intertidal zone to concentrate fish on the ebb tide, are among the oldest continuously used architectural features in North America. Some of them have been in use in the same location for more than 4,000 years. But the Mi'kmaq fish weirs are well documented. They are part of the official record. What is not part of the official record, except in fragmentary and peripheral ways, are the stone features in the upland forest above the Fundy coast, away from the tide, in the spruce fir forest of the interior uplands. These features are different from fish weirs. They are enclosed. They are sometimes elevated. They have interior features, divisions, subdivisions, what might be described as rooms within rooms, that do not serve any obvious utilitarian function. A New Brunswick provincial archaeologist named Patricia Blevins, working in the 1990s, documented a series of these upland stone enclosures in a survey area in Charlotte County, west of the St. John River watershed. Her survey report, submitted to the New Brunswick Department of Culture, Tourism and Healthy Living, was not published in any peer-reviewed venue and exists as a grey literature document in the provincial archaeology files. She documented 11 individual enclosures in a roughly 20-kilometre survey corridor, all of them in forested upland terrain, between 100 and 200 metres above sea level, all of them constructed of local granite and sandstone, all of them exhibiting the dry-laid fitting technique that is characteristic of deliberate construction rather than natural deposition. The enclosures ranged in size from a single room of perhaps 4 metres by 6 metres to a complex of what appeared to be 3 or 4 interconnected rooms, covering perhaps 200 square metres. None of them were mounded. End quote. They did not rise significantly above the surrounding terrain. They were, in a sense, the opposite of the Manitoba platform. recessed into the landscape rather than elevated above it, their walls rising only to 1 meter or 1.5 meters at most, their interiors level with or slightly below the surrounding ground surface. They were, Blevins noted, more like houses than like anything else, though she was careful to note that this analogy should not be taken to imply that they functioned as houses in any conventional sense. The Mi'kmaq oral tradition in the area where Blevins worked does not contain specific references to the stone enclosures, at least not in the forms that were available to Blevins during her survey in the 1990s. But the Mi'kmaq oral tradition does contain consistent references to the Poinak, the ancient shamanic practitioners who preceded the current Mi'kmaq cultural tradition, who are described as having built things in the upland forest that were not houses and not graves, but something between the two, places where the boundary between the living world and the spirit world was thinner than it was elsewhere. The Poinak were old when the Mi'kmaq became the Mi'kmaq. What they built was old before that. Blevins made no determination about date. She recommended further investigation. As far as the available record shows, further investigation has not occurred. The forested uplands of northern Quebec present a version of this problem on a scale that makes the New Brunswick situation look modest. The Laurentian uplands, the eroded remnant of what was once one of the oldest mountain ranges on Earth, stretch north and west from the north shore of the St. Lawrence, through Quebec and into Labrador, covering an area of roughly 1 million square kilometers of Precambrian shield terrain. This is the geological core of North America, rock that is 3 billion years old in some exposures, heavily glaciated, deeply eroded, covered in boreal forest, and punctuated by the kind of rock outcrops and ridges and inselbergs, isolated rocky summits, rising above the surrounding forest, that characterize shield topography. The inselbergs of northern Quebec are not well known outside the geological literature, but they are, in the context of this discussion, extremely significant, because they are the places where stone structures in the forest are most likely to be visible, where the accumulated peat does not reach, where the rock surface is exposed, and the work of human hands is not concealed by organic accumulation. In 1978, a Quebec provincial government aerial survey was conducted over the Laurentian uplands north of the Saguenay River as part of a resource inventory project. The survey used black and white aerial photography at a scale that was appropriate for identifying large-scale topographic features, forest cover types, and water bodies. It was not designed to identify archaeological features, but in the archive of images from that survey, which is held by the Quebec Ministry of Natural Resources and Forests, and which is accessible to researchers through a formal request process that involves a waiting period of several months, there are a number of images that show, on the summits and upper slopes of inselbergs in the survey area, features that are inconsistent with natural rock formations. A researcher at Université du Québec, a Chicoutimi, named Benoit Laramie, who was working on a study of historic indigenous land use in the Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean region in the late 1990s, was granted access to a portion of the 1,978 aerial survey archive and identified 17 separate images that showed what he described as possible constructed features on Inselberg summits. He published a brief note in a regional Quebec archaeology journal in 2001 describing the imagery and calling for ground-truthing surveys to determine whether the features were artificial. That note generated a small amount of correspondence in the journal's letters section, and then, as far as the documentary record shows, no further formal response. Laramie himself conducted partial ground surveys of 3 of the 17 inselbergs he had identified from the air, and his field notes from those surveys, which he shared with the author of a 2009 survey of Quebec Shield archaeology, describe what he found on 2 of the 3 inselbergs as clearly artificial stone arrangements. On the first, he found a series of upright stones set in a rough oval, roughly 30 meters in diameter, not large stones, perhaps 60 to 70 centimeters in height, but clearly set into the ground in a deliberate pattern with their long axes oriented radially toward a central point. On the second, he found what he described as a more complex arrangement, with a central area of roughly worked flat stone surrounded by a discontinuous ring of larger upright stones, with openings in the ring that appeared to be intentional rather than the result of collapse or disturbance. On the third inselberg, he found nothing that he could definitively identify as artificial. Either the features he had identified from the air were natural, or they had been disturbed by subsequent frost action to the point where their artificial character was no longer detectable. He noted this with the matter-of-fact disappointment of a field researcher who has driven 3 hours on a logging road and hiked 4 hours through the forest and found, at the end of it, ambiguity. The Innu, whose traditional territory covers much of the northern Quebec Shield, have oral traditions that speak of summit places, high points in the landscape where ceremonies of passage and renewal were conducted, where young men went on their vision journeys, where the elders went when they needed to speak with the forces that governed the land. Whether these summit places involve constructed stone features is not directly addressed in the available documentation of Innu oral tradition, but the spatial correspondence between the locations Laramie identified from the air and the locations that Innu elders in a 2005 land use study identified as historically significant ceremonial places is close enough to be noteworthy. Of the 17 Inselbergs Laramie flagged in the aerial survey, 11 appear to fall within areas identified as significant by Innu elders in the land use study. That could be coincidence. It could also be something else. The Haida Gwaii Archipelago, the group of islands off the north coast of British Columbia that were formerly known as the Queen Charlotte Islands, is one of the most archaeologically significant regions in all of Canada and also one of the most incompletely studied. The islands were not glaciated to the same extent as the mainland during the last glacial maximum, which means they served as a refugium, a place where life survived the ice, and which means that human occupation of the islands potentially extends much further back in time than mainland occupation does. There is genetic and archaeological evidence suggesting that the Haida people have occupied Gwaii and the surrounding archipelago for at least 12,000 years, and possibly for considerably longer. The Haida are primarily a coastal people. Their cultural tradition is centered on the sea, on the salmon rivers, on the rich intertidal environment of the island coast. Their monumental architecture, the great totem poles and plank houses, is among the most sophisticated in the pre-contact Americas. What is less well known is the interior of the islands, the forest-covered central highlands of Graham Island and Moresby Island, the upland terrain that is not easily accessible from the coast, and that has received correspondingly little archaeological attention. In the 1970s, a forester named Douglas Meny was conducting a timber inventory in the old-growth Sitka spruce and red cedar forest of the central Graham Island uplands when he encountered a series of features that he recorded in his field notes, and that were later included in a single paragraph in a 1984 report on non-timber forest values in the Queen Charlotte Islands, produced by the BC Forest Service. The features Meny described were terraced platforms, not elevated platforms in the sense of the Ontario example, but rather modifications of the natural hillside terrain, leveled areas created by cutting into the upslope face of the hill and building up the downslope face with retained stone walls to create a flat surface. The resulting features were, in Meny's description, roughly 3 to 5 meters wide and of varying length, extending, in some cases, for 20 or 30 meters along the hillside contour. The analogy that Meny reached for was agricultural terracing, and that analogy is worth sitting with for a moment, because the idea of agricultural terracing in the rainforest interior of Haida Gwaii does not fit any standard model of Haida cultural practice. The Haida did not, as far as the conventional archaeological understanding goes, practice agriculture. They were hunter-gatherers with a sophisticated marine economy and an elaborate material culture, but they did not cultivate crops in the way that, say, the indigenous peoples of the Southwest or Mesoamerica did, except that they did cultivate. That is something that archaeologists studying Northwest Coast indigenous land management have been increasingly documenting over the last 2 decades. The Haida and their neighbors managed berry patches, harvested and replanted root crops, modified stream channels to improve salmon runs, and engaged in a range of what could be called semi-agricultural practices that increased the productivity of the landscape in ways that the early European observers, looking for cultivation in the European sense, failed to recognize. The terracing on the Graham Island uplands might be evidence of exactly that kind of management, a deliberate modification of the hillside terrain to create productive microhabitats for berry cultivation or root harvest, sustained over a period long enough that the retaining walls became substantial stone constructions. But the timescale implied by the age of the forest covering and surrounding the terraces, some of the trees on and adjacent to the terraced areas, are over 400 years old, and the lichen development on the terrace walls suggests considerable additional age, means that this cultivation, if that is what it was practiced at a scale and over a duration that has no close analogue in the documented record of Northwest Coast land management. It suggests a level of landscape investment that implies permanence, that implies a relationship with the land that went well beyond the seasonal round, that implies, in a word, civilization in the sense of a organized, sustained, multi-generational commitment to the transformation of a landscape. The Haida Gwaii Council of the Haida Nation, which has been involved in documentation projects in the old-growth forest for several decades, is aware of the terrace features. Their land use documentation includes references to specific locations in the central Graham Island uplands that are identified as places of old habitation, places that were different before, places where the ancestors did things we no longer do in the same way. That is a description that acknowledges cultural change without erasing cultural memory, and it is a form of knowledge that the archaeological record, when it exists at all, tends to confirm rather than contradict. What the Haida Gwaii example illustrates, and what the boreal forest examples from Manitoba and Ontario and New Brunswick and Quebec illustrate in their various ways, is a consistent pattern. There are features in the Canadian forest that are not explained by any currently accepted model of pre-contact Indigenous land use. Those features are old enough that their antiquity is a function of physical evidence, lichen growth, tree age, soil development, peat accumulation, rather than of any date derived from formal archaeological investigation. They are accompanied, in most cases, by oral traditions that acknowledge their existence while locating their construction in a period before living memory, sometimes a period before ancestral memory, a time so distant that the builders are described not as ancestors, but as something else, something that was there before and left their work in the landscape when they were gone. That pattern is significant. It suggests not a single anomalous site, but a category of site, a type of landscape feature that was once widespread across the forested regions of Canada and that is now largely invisible, concealed by the very forest that, in a sense, preserved it. The Vancouver Island old-growth forest presents a version of this problem that is particularly acute, because Vancouver Island has been more intensively studied than most of the boreal forest regions, and yet the anomalous features persist. Vancouver Island's old-growth temperate rainforest, concentrated in the central and northern portions of the island and in the Walburn Valley and other protected areas in the south, supports some of the largest trees in Canada, ancient Douglas fir and western red cedar, that in some cases exceed 50 meters in height and 8 meters in circumference at the base. These trees are old, some of them over 1,000 years old, and their root systems are correspondingly massive, penetrating deep into the soil and bedrock, and in many cases, encasing and encapsulating whatever lies beneath them. What lies beneath them, in a number of documented instances, is stone. The documentation of stone features beneath old-growth root systems on Vancouver Island comes primarily from two sources: from the loggers who encountered them when old-growth trees were felled during the intensive logging of the second half of the 20th century, and from the forest ecologists and archaeologists who began systematic survey of old-growth sites in the 1980s and 1990s as part of the environmental assessment process that accompanied the contentious battles over old-growth logging on the island. The logger accounts are almost entirely informal, preserved in oral tradition among the logging community rather than in any official record. The pattern they describe is consistent. A tree falls, the root ball comes up, and beneath the root ball there is stone, worked stone. Stone that is fitted or shaped or arranged in a way that is not consistent with natural glacial deposition. The loggers, whose relationship with the forest was practical rather than archaeological, generally did not report these features to any authority. Some of them documented them in photographs, some of which have found their way into regional archive collections. Some of them simply noted the feature and moved on to the next tree. The ecologist and archaeologist accounts are more formal, more systematically recorded, but they share the same essential structure. During survey work in old-growth stands, field workers encounter, either by visual inspection or by probing the soil with survey rods, stone features beneath the accumulated organic material that cannot be accounted for by natural processes. a 1,993 survey report for the Clayoquot Sound area, which was at that time the subject of intense controversy over logging rights, documents 3 separate locations in old-growth forest where stone features were identified beneath the root systems of fallen or dying old-growth trees. The report recommends further investigation. The investigation, as far as the record shows, did not occur because the primary purpose of the survey was to assess logging impacts, and the stone features were tangential to that mandate. The Nuu-chah-nulth people, whose traditional territories cover most of the west coast of Vancouver Island, including the Clayoquot Sound region, have oral traditions that speak of structures in the forest interior, things built by the first people, which in the Nuu-chah-nulth oral tradition refers not to the current Nuu-chah-nulth people but to the people who were there before, the original occupants of the land, whose relationship with the physical world was of a different order than the relationship that followed. The forest structures in the Nuu-chah-nulth tradition are not described in detail, and the oral accounts do not specify their construction materials or their dimensions. But they are described as being still there, still in the forest, hidden by the trees that grew over them, which is as accurate a description as any that a scientific survey has produced. What the Nuu-chah-nulth oral tradition adds, which the scientific survey cannot, is context. The structures are not described as ruins. They are not described as abandoned. They are described as resting, as waiting, as continuing to function in some sense that does not require human presence or maintenance. That is a fundamentally different relationship to built space than the Western archaeological concept of a site implies. A site, in the archaeological framework, is a location of past human activity. In the Nuu-chah-nulth framework, what was built in the forest continues to have presence, continues to be part of the living landscape, regardless of whether anyone is actively using it in the way that a Western observer would recognize as use. That distinction matters because it explains why these features have not been destroyed. In many cases, indigenous communities with knowledge of forest stone features have actively or passively protected them, not because they have been formally designated as archaeological sites, but because they are understood to have a continuing relationship with the land and the communities that live on the land. The forest hides them, and the knowledge hides them, and both forms of hiding are understood as appropriate, as forms of protection rather than concealment. The Yukon's boreal forest presents the northernmost version of this pattern, and in some ways the most dramatic. The Yukon is vast, roughly the size of France and Spain combined, with a population of under 50,000 people, concentrated almost entirely in the Whitehorse area. The Yukon interior is among the most remote terrain in North America, accessible in many areas only by small aircraft or, in winter, by snowmobile, across frozen rivers and lake surfaces. The archaeology of the Yukon interior is correspondingly limited, concentrated on a relatively small number of well-known sites, primarily in the Old Crow Flats area and along the major river systems. What the river system surveys have documented, however, and what the small number of interior surveys have confirmed, is that the Yukon's boreal forest contains a far denser pattern of human landscape modification than the official record suggests. The most thoroughly documented of these modifications are the hunting structures, the stone blinds, and deadfall settings, and drive fences that the Athapascan-speaking peoples of the Yukon interior use to manage caribou and other large game across vast distances of landscape. These features are old, some of them thousands of years old, and they are distributed across the landscape in patterns that reveal a sophisticated and comprehensive understanding of animal behavior and landscape ecology that could only have been developed over many generations of intense observation and experimentation. But the drive fences are recognized in the official record. They are documented in a significant number of archaeological surveys. They are understood, even if they are not always protected. What is less recognized is a separate category of stone feature that appears in the Yukon interior at locations that have no obvious relationship to hunting or game management, that appear on ridge crests and rocky hilltops and exposed bedrock surfaces in the forest, and that do not resemble the hunting structures in their construction or their spatial distribution. A Yukon government archaeologist named Claire Whitaker documented a series of these features in the 1990s as part of a survey associated with a proposed mining road in the Pelly Mountains area. Her survey report, available in the Yukon government's archaeology permit files, describes what she found on 3 separate rocky ridge crests within the survey corridor as stone features of unknown function and considerable age. The features consisted, in her description, of carefully arranged upright stones in groupings of 5 to 12 stones each, oriented in various configurations that she could not immediately relate to any documented construction technique, set in bedrock pockets or wedged against natural crack features in the exposed granite. The stones had been transported, in some cases, from sources that were not immediately adjacent to the ridge crest, implying significant effort and deliberate selection. Whitaker consulted with First Nations elders from the Selkirk First Nation, whose traditional territory includes the survey area, and recorded their responses to her description of the features. The elder she spoke with, whose name she records only as a woman elder from Pelly Crossing, described the features as markers of the old ones, places where the people who knew the country before marked the land, so that those who came after would know it was known. That formulation, "the land is known," is one that Whitaker found herself returning to in her report conclusions, because it captures something that the archaeological vocabulary of the time did not have a ready term for. The features were not monuments in the conventional sense. They were not graves. They were not hunting structures. They were markers of knowledge, 3-dimensional inscriptions in the landscape recording that someone had been here, had understood this place, had chosen this place as worth marking. When you build a marker in a place that is already remote, already difficult of access, already defined by the characteristics of its terrain, you are doing something different from building a monument in a valley or a crossing or a place where people naturally congregate. You are saying that the difficulty of the place is part of the point, that the effort of reaching it is part of the meaning, that the marker means more because it is here, in the hard place, the wind-exposed ridge, the rocky summit, than it would mean in any easier location. That logic is not unique to the Yukon. It appears in the Innu oral tradition about the Quebec-Inselberg summits. It appears in the Anishinaabe tradition about the high places of meeting in the boreal forest of Ontario and Manitoba. It appears in the Nuchar-Nulth tradition about the First Peoples structures in the Vancouver Island forest interior. The hard place is the right place. The difficulty is the argument for the significance of what was done there. The implication, if this logic is correct, is that the forest stone features of Canada are not scattered accidents of preservation. They are the visible remnants of a comprehensive system of landscape marking and knowledge inscription that once covered the entire forest, that was placed deliberately in the locations where it would persist, where the rock was exposed and the peat did not accumulate, and the trees grew over rather than through, and that is still there, still waiting, in hundreds and perhaps thousands of locations that no one has yet identified or formally recorded. In the summer of 2019, a wildfire burned through a roughly 300 square kilometre area of boreal forest in northern Saskatchewan, south of the Clearwater River. Wildfires are a natural and essential part of the boreal forest cycle, and the post-fire landscape, stripped of its canopy and its accumulated organic material, is one of the best opportunities that Canadian archaeologists have to identify features that are normally invisible beneath the forest. The Clearwater Fire, as it came to be known in the archaeological literature, produced exactly that opportunity, and a rapid response archaeological survey was organised for the following summer, 2020, to document whatever the fire had revealed. The survey team, from the University of Saskatchewan and the Prince Albert Grand Council, spent 6 weeks documenting the burned area. Their preliminary report, which was submitted to the Saskatchewan Ministry of Environment in late 2020, and which has been available as a grey literature document in the provincial archaeology files since that date, documents what the team found, and what they found was considerably more than they had expected to find. In the burned area, the fire had removed the organic layer from approximately 60% of the survey corridor. In that 60%, the team identified and recorded 114 discrete archaeological features. Of those, 47 were known types, drivelines and hearths, and tent ring features, and stone cache structures that fit within the existing framework of northern Saskatchewan pre-contact archaeology. The remaining 67 features did not fit. They were stone features of various sizes and configurations, some of them single upright markers, some of them low walls, some of them circular or semicircular arrangements. that the team could not classify using the existing typological framework. The report notes, with the careful neutrality of academic writing, that these 67 features represent a component of the pre-contact archaeological record in the boreal forest of northern Saskatchewan that is not currently reflected in the site database and that warrants systematic study. The report recommends a follow-up survey season with specific attention to the unclassified feature types and consultation with Woodland Cree knowledge holders about the possible cultural context of the features. The follow-up survey, as of the most recent available record, has not yet been conducted. Those 67 features were in 300 square kilometers of boreal forest. The boreal forest of northern Saskatchewan alone covers approximately 350,000 square kilometers. If the proportion of unclassified stone features visible in the burned Clearwater corridor is even remotely representative of what exists across the boreal landscape as a whole, the implication is that there are tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands, of unrecorded stone features in the northern Saskatchewan forest alone, all of them invisible beneath the canopy and the accumulated organic layer, all of them waiting for the next wildfire to reveal them, or for someone to find a way to see beneath the trees. The Algoma district of northern Ontario is a region of particular significance in this discussion, and not primarily because of anything that has been formally discovered there. It is significant because of what the landscape itself tells you when you look at it from the right angle. The Algoma Highlands are a zone of elevated Canadian shield terrain between Lake Huron and Lake Superior, a landscape of rocky ridges and boreal forest and dark lakes that has been, since the early 20th century, associated in the Canadian cultural imagination with the landscape paintings of the Group of Seven, those iconic images of twisted spruce and granite outcrops and lakes, the colour of pewter that defined a certain idea of what Canada looked like and what Canada meant. What the Group of Seven painted was the surface of the Algoma landscape, the spectacular visual surface, the theatrical geology. What they painted around, what they did not stop to examine, was the stone work at their feet. The cliff faces of the Algoma Highlands, particularly along the erosional escarpments that run roughly parallel to the Lake Superior shore, show a kind of modification that has been noted by geologists, hikers, and canoeists for generations, and that has been consistently categorized as either natural or of recent non-Indigenous origin, because neither of those alternatives requires any revision of the standard narrative. The modification consists of horizontal terracing on the cliff face and on the talus slopes below the cliffs, of low stone walls built against the cliff face that create level surfaces, perhaps 2 meters wide and of varying length, stepping down the cliff from upper to lower elevations in a pattern that is, to the eye, strikingly similar to cliff face terracing in other parts of the world, in the Andes, in the Mediterranean, in East Asia, where terracing has been formally identified as a technique of landscape management for agriculture or for habitation. The idea of terraced cliff faces in the Algoma district of Ontario has not, as far as the available literature indicates, been proposed by any formal archaeological study, but a 2007 study of archaeological features along the north shore of Lake Superior, conducted by the Michipicoten First Nation, noted that community knowledge holders had consistently identified locations along the Algoma escarpment as places where the old people lived and worked, places where things were built that are still there, and that these identifications corresponded, in the locations where ground truth surveys were possible, with the stone terrace features on the cliff faces. The Michipicoten First Nation is an Anishinaabe community whose traditional territory includes the Lake Superior North Shore and the Algoma Highlands above it. Their oral tradition does not distinguish, in the way that academic archaeology does, between ancient and recent, between pre-contact and post-contact, between indigenous and non-indigenous. It distinguishes between things that the community understands, things that have an explanation in the living knowledge system of the community, and things that do not have such an explanation, things that belong to a category that might be translated as what the old ones left. The cliff-face terraces in the Algoma Highlands belong, in the Michipicoten tradition, to what the old ones left. They are not Anishinaabe constructions. They are constructions that the Anishinaabe found when they came to the land, already old, already becoming part of the cliff, already so thoroughly integrated into the stone of the escarpment that the distinction between built and natural had been erased by time. That is, again, a version of the same thing that the Cree say about the boreal forest paths, and the Haida say about the Graham Island terraces, and the New Char Nulth say about the Vancouver Island forest structures, not ours, found, old before we came, still here. There is a research methodology that has been developing, quietly and without much institutional support, in the margins of Canadian archaeology for the last 20 or 30 years, that takes these oral tradition accounts as primary data rather than as supplementary colour. The practitioners of this methodology, most of them associated with Indigenous universities, or with research programs that are community-based rather than institution-based, proceed from the assumption that oral traditions that have persisted for multiple generations across diverse cultural contexts are telling you something real about the landscape and the human history embedded in it, and that the job of the researcher is not to test the oral tradition against the archaeological record, but to use the oral tradition to guide the archaeological investigation. The results of this approach, in those cases where it has been applied in the Canadian forest context, are consistent with what the independent lines of evidence from surveyors and foresters and geologists and fire survey teams suggest. There are things in the forest. They are old. They are distributed across the landscape in patterns that suggest a coherent system rather than isolated incidents. And the communities whose ancestors lived alongside these features for the longest time have the most detailed and the most specific knowledge of where they are and what they might mean. The implication for Canadian archaeology is significant. It suggests that the standard model of pre-contact Canadian history, which envisions the boreal forest as a landscape of mobile hunting and gathering peoples who left few permanent traces, is wrong, or at least radically incomplete. It suggests that the boreal forest was, at some point in the past, a landscape of considerable built complexity, of permanent or semi-permanent installations, of constructed features that organized the landscape and encoded knowledge in stone. It suggests that what we call the wilderness, the great empty forest of the Canadian Shield and the boreal zone, was neither empty nor, in any meaningful sense, wild. The question of who built these features is one that the current evidence cannot answer precisely. What the evidence can say, based on the physical characteristics of the features and the oral traditions associated with them, is that they were built by people who had a sophisticated understanding of stone construction, who had the social organization to coordinate large-scale landscape modification, who had the time and the stability to invest in permanent features rather than in temporary camps and seasonal shelters, and who had a relationship with the landscape that was systematic enough to produce features that are distributed across thousands of kilometers in patterns that suggest a coherent spatial logic rather than random accumulation. Those characteristics describe a level of social and organizational complexity that the conventional model of boreal forest pre-contact peoples does not easily accommodate. They describe something that, if it were found in the archaeological record of the Mediterranean or the Near East or East Asia, would be called a civilization without hesitation. That it has not been called that in the Canadian context is partly a matter of evidence, because the evidence is fragmentary and incompletely documented. But it is also a matter of expectation, of the assumptions that researchers bring to the landscape before they begin to look, which determine what they are capable of seeing when they arrive. The peat does not lie. It accumulates at a rate that allows a reasonable calculation of the minimum age of anything buried beneath it. The lichen does not lie. Its growth rate is slow enough that colonies of significant size indicate centuries of development at minimum. The tree does not lie. The 400-year-old cedar growing from the terrace wall, its roots wrapped around the fitted stone, is as accurate a date as any laboratory analysis of extracted charcoal, and what it says is that the wall was there first. These are not interpretations, they are observations. The interpretation is what connects them, and the interpretation that connects them most coherently is that somewhere in the Canadian forest, across a span of time that is not yet established, but that is certainly long, people built things. They built things in the hard places and the high places and the deep forest. They built things that were intended to last and that have lasted, beyond the culture that built them, beyond the ecological community that surrounded them at the time of their construction, into a forest that has grown up around them and over them and through them. The things are still there. The Labrador interior is one of the most remote and least studied regions in all of Canada, a vast tableland of Precambrian shield terrain covered in spruce fir boreal forest and underlain, in many areas, by permafrost. The Labrador interior sees perhaps a dozen or 24 archaeologists in any given year, if that, and most of them are working along the known corridors, the river systems and lake chains that provided the travel routes for the Innu and, before them, for the maritime archaic peoples who occupied the Labrador coast and interior for thousands of years before the Innu's ancestors arrived. The maritime archaic tradition is worth a brief consideration in this context, because it is one of the most culturally sophisticated and archaeologically significant pre-contact traditions in North America, and it is one of the least known. The maritime archaic people occupied the entire Atlantic coast of Canada and the northeastern United States from roughly 9,000 years ago to roughly 3,500 years ago. They were sophisticated sea hunters who pursued large sea mammals including walrus and beluga and possibly bowhead whale. They had an elaborate ceremonial tradition that has been documented at burial sites in Newfoundland and Labrador, and their trade networks extended from the Gulf of Mexico to the high Arctic. What is less understood is the extent of their presence in the Labrador interior. The Mealy Mountains, the highest terrain in Labrador, rising to over 1,100 meters in their highest peaks, were within the traditional territory of the maritime archaic peoples during their occupation, and the exposed rocky summits and upper slopes of the Mealy Range present exactly the kind of terrain: exposed bedrock, minimal peat accumulation, good visibility, that should preserve stone features, if any were constructed there. A 2013 field survey conducted as part of an environmental assessment for a proposed wind energy project in the Mealy Mountain area documented, as a peripheral finding, a number of stone features on exposed ridge crests and rocky summits in the survey corridor. The features were described as cairns and stone arrangements of possible pre-contact origin, and they were referred for follow-up archaeological assessment. The follow-up assessment, which was conducted the following year by a consulting firm, found the features to be, in its assessment, of uncertain origin and not demonstrably pre-contact, and recommended that they be considered of low archaeological significance, pending further research. That determination, of low archaeological significance, pending further research, is a formulation that appears with remarkable frequency in the archaeological consulting literature related to forest stone features in Canada. It is a formulation that defers decision by creating a condition, pending further research, that is unlikely to be met because the further research is not funded and no one is responsible for conducting it. The feature is neither protected nor dismissed. It simply sits in limbo, in the files of a consulting firm and the environmental assessment archive of a provincial government department, waiting for a further research that will probably not arrive. The Innu of Sheshatshiu and Natuashish, whose traditional territory includes the Mealy Mountains, have a term in their language for elevated stone places that were used in the period of the Old Ones, a term that refers specifically to places of spiritual power on high ground, places where the thin boundary between the physical world and the world of the Mistapeo, the great beings who organized the natural world, was accessible to human beings who came to these places in the right way and at the right time. The spatial distribution of these places in the Innu oral tradition, as documented in land use studies conducted in collaboration with the Innu Nation, corresponds closely with the locations of the stone features identified in the 2013 to 2014 Mealy Mountain surveys. That correspondence is not proof of anything in the strict evidentiary sense that archaeological practice demands, but it is consistent, and consistency across independent lines of evidence is how knowledge builds, slowly, without certainty, toward understanding. The Hudson Bay lowlands present a fundamentally different landscape from the shield and boreal forest regions that have dominated this discussion so far. The lowlands are flat, low, and very wet, a vast coastal plain that borders the southern shore of Hudson Bay and James Bay, covering roughly 300,000 square kilometers of Ontario, Manitoba, and Quebec. The landscape is peat bog and muskeg and black spruce and tamarack, underlain by clay and marine sediment deposited during and after the last glaciation, when the Tyrrell Sea occupied much of the area that is now the lowlands. The Tyrrell Sea phase is relevant here because it means that much of the Hudson Bay lowlands was underwater until relatively recently in geological terms. the last 3 to 4,000 years in many areas, as isostatic rebound lifted the land above sea level. In the areas that emerged from the sea most recently, the landscape is still in the process of being colonized by vegetation, and the exposed sediment surfaces reveal features that in older terrain would be buried under peat and forest. In these newly emergent coastal areas, particularly along the James Bay shore, archaeologists working with the Mushkegowuk Cree communities have documented features in the former intertidal zone and on low coastal ridges that do not fit the model of simple Cree or pre-Cree occupation that the conventional narrative would predict. The features include stone arrangements on raised beach ridges that are radiocarbon dated to the period of their emergence from the sea, meaning they were built on surfaces that had only recently appeared above the water by people who were rapidly occupying a landscape that was literally being created by isostatic uplift in real time. Those features are archaeological evidence for one of the most remarkable things about the human occupation of the Hudson Bay lowlands, which is its antiquity relative to the land surface itself. The people who built stone arrangements on ridges that had just emerged from the sea were responding to a landscape in rapid change, a landscape that was creating new territory at rates that a single human lifetime could observe and measure. They were building on ground that had not existed when their parents were born, and they were building in stone, which suggests that they intended to mark what they had found, to leave a record of their presence on the new land, to say, in the most durable available medium, that this place was known. The James Bay stone arrangements have been studied more systematically than most of the features discussed in this account, primarily because the Mushkegowuk Cree land use documentation process, which has been ongoing since the 1990s, has included systematic survey of the coastal zone and has produced a relatively well-documented record of the stone features in that area. What the documentation reveals is a pattern of stone arrangement types that ranges from simple single stone markers to complex multi-stone configurations, distributed along the emerged coastal ridges in a pattern that corresponds, in the understanding of Cree knowledge holders, to a system of landmarking that tracked the progressive emergence of new land from the sea over many generations. That is, to be clear about what it implies, a system of observation that extended over centuries, in which successive generations of observers noted and marked the slow retreat of the sea and the slow emergence of new land, recording their observations in stone, creating a geological diary of coastal change that persists on the landscape today. That is a level of sustained, multi-generational, collaborative scientific observation that would be impressive in any context. In the context of a people who are conventionally described as simple nomadic hunter-gatherers, with no tradition of monument building or systematic landscape recording, it is extraordinary. In the northern reaches of Prince Edward Island, where the Northumberland Strait narrows to its closest approach between the island and the New Brunswick shore, there is a series of tidal, flat features that have been a subject of periodic interest since at least the early 20th century. The features are fish weirs in a broad sense, stone structures in the intertidal zone designed to concentrate fish at low tide, but they are not the simple V-shaped Mi'kmaq weirs of the type documented on the Nova Scotia and New Brunswick coasts. They are more complex, consisting of networks of intersecting stone walls that create a series of chambers and channels in the tidal flat, sophisticated enough in their hydraulic engineering to suggest significant accumulated knowledge of tidal dynamics and fish behavior. The question of who built the Prince Edward Island tidal weir systems is one that has been tentatively addressed in a small number of academic publications and more extensively in Mi'kmaq oral tradition. The academic publications, drawing on artifact analysis and radiocarbon dates from associated deposits, suggest occupation of the weir sites from at least 2,000 years ago, possibly considerably earlier. The Mi'kmaq oral tradition suggests that the weirs were built by the people who were on the island before the Mi'kmaq, the ones the Mi'kmaq call in some accounts the ancient fishers, who knew the tides of the strait better than anyone since has known them. That description, better than anyone since, is worth pausing on. It is a description of expertise, of a level of knowledge of the specific hydraulics of this specific body of water that has not been equaled in the time since those people were gone. The weirs that those people built, according to Mi'kmaq oral tradition, worked better than the weirs that the Mi'kmaq built after them, because the ancient fishers understood things about how the water moved that the Mi'kmaq, skilled as they were, had not fully recovered. What does it mean for a knowledge tradition to be partially lost? What does it mean for a community to inherit not just the physical constructions of a previous people, but the partial residue of the understanding that produced those constructions? It means that the constructions are a kind of message, encoded in stone, about what the builders knew. The weir is a demonstration of fluid dynamics. The terrace is a demonstration of soil science. The elevated platform is a demonstration of astronomy. The stone wall on the ridge is a demonstration of something that might be called landscape logic, the understanding of how terrain and vision and movement and knowledge intersect in a specific place at a specific time. The forests of Canada are full of these demonstrations. They are full of proofs of knowledge that we no longer possess, encoded in materials that outlast the minds that produced them, waiting for someone to read them in the language in which they were written, which is the language of stone and soil and sightline and accumulated time. In the spring of 2016, a hiking trail maintenance crew working in a provincial park in northern New Brunswick encountered a stone feature in the forest above the trail corridor. The crew leader, a woman named Sylvie Thibault, who had been working trails in the region for 15 years, had never seen anything like it. She took photographs on her phone. She reported it to the park superintendent. The superintendent passed it to the provincial archaeology office. A provincial archaeologist visited the site and documented it as a stone feature of possible pre-contact origin, probably indigenous, warranting further study. No further study had been scheduled, as of the last report I could locate. Thibault's photographs show a rough circular arrangement of stones, roughly 6 meters in diameter, constructed of local sandstone in courses that rise perhaps to the knee height at their best preserved sections. The interior of the circle is clear, and the ground inside the circle is, in the photographs, noticeably different in color from the surrounding forest floor, darker, richer, suggesting that the soil inside the enclosure has a different composition or a different cultivation history than the soil outside it. You can see, in those photographs, the lichen on the stones. You can see how the forest floor has built up against the outside of the wall, while the interior remains slightly lower, a function of the walls having retained the organic accumulation of centuries outside its perimeter, while the interior remained relatively open. You can see a spruce tree growing from a gap in the wall on the eastern side, its roots following the line of the stones for a meter before descending into the ground, which tells you that the tree, which is at least a century old by its trunk diameter, found the gap already there when its seed landed. And you can see, if you look at the photographs in the right order, the moment when Thibault understood that she was not looking at a natural feature. It is in the 5th photograph, which shows the complete circle from a slightly elevated vantage point on a boulder outside the ring. From that angle, the circularity of the arrangement is unmistakable. Not the rough circle of a glacial erratic cluster, not the coincidental arrangement of frost-heaved boulders. A circle, deliberate, measured, sustained around its entire circumference to a consistency that no natural process produces. Someone made this. Someone chose this place in the forest, cleared it of trees and soil to the bedrock, brought stones here, and built a circle. And then the forest grew back over it, and around it, and through it, and 2,000 years passed, or 4,000, and a trail maintenance crew found it in the spring. The forests of Canada are enormous. They are old, they are dark and deep and, by almost any measure of landscape archaeology, almost entirely unstudied. What has been found in them, by accident and by the patient application of oral tradition and occasional deliberate survey, suggests something that the official record of Canadian pre-contact history has not yet been willing to formally acknowledge. That there was more here than the standard model admits, that the people who lived in this forest before European contact were not simply passing through it with their nets and their snares and their seasonal rounds, that they built things, that some of those things were large and complex and carefully made, that some of those things were so carefully made that they have survived 3 or 4 or 5,000 years of boreal forest growth without being destroyed, only concealed. The concealment is not permanent. Fires reveal what the forest hides. LiDAR surveys, when conducted, penetrate the canopy and produce images of the ground surface beneath in extraordinary detail. Images that have already, in the few areas where LiDAR has been applied systematically, revealed road networks and earthworks and linear features that were completely invisible from the surface. The technology exists to see beneath the forest. The will to use it systematically, the funding, the institutional commitment to asking the question seriously is what has been lacking. And the oral tradition. The oral tradition is the oldest LiDAR there is. The accumulated knowledge of thousands of years of people living in close attention to the landscape, encoding what they saw in language and story and place, name and ceremony. When a Cree elder says that the old paths are under the forest, that is not metaphor. That is geographical information, encoded in the most durable available medium, which is human memory sustained by community practice over generations. When the Innu say the high places are still there, they are saying something that ground survey consistently confirms. When the Nu Char Nulth say the first people built things in the forest that are still there, they are saying something that root systems of fallen old-growth trees confirm when they come up and show the stone beneath. The forest is a library. The stones are the books, and we have barely begun to read. The Northwest Territories present a scale of this problem that is almost impossible to hold in the mind. The NWT covers nearly 1.5 million square kilometers, from the 60th parallel north to the Arctic Ocean, from the Yukon border in the west to Nunavut in the east. It includes the vast drainage basin of the Mackenzie River, the deepest lake in the Western Hemisphere in the form of Great Slave Lake, and boreal forest that in the south grades into subarctic scrub and eventually into tundra in the north. Great Slave Lake is approximately the size of Scotland. Its shoreline extends for roughly 3,000 kilometers, and along portions of that shoreline, in the areas where exposed Canadian shield bedrock meets the lake margin and the boreal forest gives way temporarily to rocky points and outcrops, there are stone features that have been reported by fishers and hunters and canoeists for generations, and that have been formally documented only in the most fragmentary way. A 1,996 NWT Government Resource Inventory, a background document for a territorial land use planning exercise, included a brief survey of known or suspected archaeological features in the Great Slave Lake Basin. The survey was not an archaeological survey in the professional sense. It was a compilation of reported features from various sources, including reports from resource users, from First Nations land use studies, and from the fragmentary academic archaeological literature on the region. The NWT archaeological literature is sparse enough that a complete review of it for the Great Slave Lake Basin can be conducted in a few days, which is itself a statement about how little formal investigation has occurred. Among the features documented in the 1996 inventory were what the report describes as possible stone structures on exposed bedrock points along the south shore of Great Slave Lake, reported by Dene hunters and fishers as being visible at low water levels in dry summers. The report notes that these features have not been formally assessed, and that their character, age, and cultural affiliation are unknown. It recommends that a formal survey be conducted at the next opportunity of low water combined with favorable access conditions. No such survey is recorded in the subsequent NWT archaeological permit files, which are the primary source for what formal archaeological investigation has occurred in the territory. The features remain in the inventory, unassessed, reported but not confirmed, known but not known. The Yellowknives Dene, the Chipewyan, and the Tliko Dogrib peoples all have traditional territories that include portions of the Great Slave Lake shoreline. Their oral traditions speak of the lakeshore as a landscape of considerable historical depth, a place where the relationship between land and water has been managed and marked over many generations, where specific shoreline locations carry specific meanings in the ceremonial and practical traditions of the communities. The stone features that resource users report in low water years correspond, in the accounts of Dene elders consulted in land use studies, to places that are known, places that have names, places that are part of the inherited geography of the lake that has been passed down in Dene knowledge systems across many generations. A place that has a name, in the context of indigenous North American knowledge systems, is a place that has been attended to. It is a place that someone, at some point, understood well enough to characterize in language, to attach a meaningful designation that communicates something about the place's character, its history, its significance, to someone who will come after. The named places along the Great Slave Lake shoreline that correspond to the reported stone features are places that the Dene have attended to long enough to name. The naming is itself evidence of the depth of human engagement with those places. What does all of this add up to? It adds up to a picture that is profoundly different from the one that appears in the standard history of pre-contact Canada. The standard history envisions the boreal forest as a backdrop, a setting through which small bands of hunter-gatherers moved seasonally, leaving few traces because their way of life was light on the land, because they were adapted to a northern environment that did not permit the kind of intensive, sedentary, architecturally complex civilization that arose in warmer regions. That picture is not entirely wrong. The boreal forest does not permit intensive agriculture. The northern winter does impose a mobility requirement that the tropics do not. The people who lived in the boreal forest were genuinely adapted to its demands in ways that are remarkable and that deserve far more study and respect than they have generally received. But the picture is incomplete in a way that matters. It assumes that adaptation to northern conditions means absence of architectural complexity. It assumes that mobility means lack of permanence. It assumes that because the forest people did not build cities, they did not build. And the evidence, fragmentary and scattered and largely informal as it is, contradicts that assumption consistently and in enough different contexts, and by enough different independent lines of evidence, that the assumption can no longer be held without acknowledged uncertainty. The stone road in the Manitoba forest that Aldcroft's survey team found in 1907 and covered back over, the granite platform in the Kenora district old growth that Delaney measured and recorded in 1961, the fitted wall on the Grass River Provincial Park Ridge that Thiebaud logged in her Manitoba Geological Survey report in 1988, the enclosures in the New Brunswick uplands that Blevins documented and filed in the Provincial Archaeology Archive in the 1990s, the Inselberg summit features of northern Quebec that Laramie identified from the air and partially confirmed on the ground, the Haida-Gwaii interior terraces that many measured and described in his 1970s forestry notes, the Vancouver Island old-growth root ball stone features documented in a dozen informal reports and occasional formal surveys, the Yukon ridge markers that Whitaker described in her Pelly Mountains survey, the Saskatchewan wildfire corridor with its 67 unclassified stone features, the Algoma cliff face terracing that the Michipicoten First Nation knows as what the old ones left, the James Bay coastal ridge stone arrangements that track the emergence of new land from the sea, the PEI tidal flat weir systems that the Micmac describe as being built by people who knew the tides better than anyone since, the Labrador Mealy Mountain Ridge, features that the Innu locate within their tradition of elevated spiritual places, the Great Slave Lake shoreline features that the Dene name and remember and have never stopped attending to. These are not stories about a single site or a single discovery. They are stories about a pattern, and the pattern is clear enough, if you are willing to look at it, to say something real. There was more here than the history books say. There was building and marking and enclosing and terracing and road making and platform raising across a landscape that the standard account describes as empty. The emptiness is a function of the forest and the peat and the canopy and the political and intellectual assumptions that have governed Canadian archaeological practice for the last 150 years, not a function of actual absence. The things are in the forest. They have been in the forest for a very long time. Some of them are being found now, when wildfires strip away the concealment, or when LiDAR surveys are conducted in areas where funding and political will happen to coincide, or when a logging crew or a trail maintenance worker or a survey team happens to look at the right angle at the right moment and sees what the forest has been keeping. The forest is patient. It has been keeping these things for millennia. It will keep them a little longer, while we find the will and the resources and the intellectual openness to look for them properly, to look with the seriousness that the scale of what is there requires. And while we are finding that will, the oral traditions are holding. The Cree elders know where the old paths are. The Innu know where the high places are. The Haida know where the old people worked. The Nucharnulth know where the first people built. The Dene know the names of the stone places along the Great Slave Lake shore. The Micmac know who built the weirs. The Anishinaabe know what the high places of meeting were for. The Innu know whose territory the Mealy Mountain summits belong to in a sense that predates their own arrival on the land. That knowledge is a map. It is a map of a landscape that has been inhabited for so long and so carefully and so intelligently that the accumulated intelligence of that habitation is woven into the land itself, inscribed in stone and encoded in language, and kept alive by communities who have, through everything that has happened in the last 500 years, maintained their relationship with a landscape that their ancestors transformed, and that has, in return, transformed them. The forest holds the stone holds the knowledge lives in the communities, and the communities are still here. That is the story that the unexplained megalithic sites of Canada's forests are telling, if you are willing to sit with the forest long enough and quietly enough to hear it. It is a story about time, about the depth of human presence in this landscape, about the persistence of knowledge across scales of time that defeat the imagination. It is a story about what survives when you build in the right material, in the hard places, in the places where the peat does not reach and the canopy cannot fully close, and the lichen grows on the stone and marks the passage of centuries in its slow, grey, deliberate way. The night is quieter now. The forest that exists in the imagination that these stories build is dark and dense and enormous, and somewhere in it, under the spruce and the fir and the cedar and the pine, under the accumulated generations of fallen needles and decaying organic matter and the patient incremental work of the peat, there are stones that were placed there by hands that have been dust for a very long time. Stones fitted against other stones, with a care that the fitting required something beyond mere utility. Stones arranged in circles and lines and enclosures, and on hilltops and ridge crests and cliff faces and tidal flats, wherever the logic of the landscape and the knowledge of the builders said this is the place, this is where we mark what we know. They marked it. The forest grew over the mark. The mark is still there. The map is still there. Sleep well. The forest is patient. It is keeping everything it has been given to keep, and it will keep it until we are ready to find it. And when we are ready to find it, we will find more than we expected. And the story will be longer and older and more complicated and more beautiful than the version we thought we knew. If you made it this far into the night with this story, thank you for giving it the time it takes. These things do not unfold quickly, neither does the forest. Subscribe if you want more of this, more of the slow work of looking at what has been overlooked, more of the patient reconstruction of a past that is larger and stranger and more deeply human than the history we were taught. And let me know where you are right now, what forest or what city or what dark room you are in, and what time it is where you are. The stone is in the forest is in the dark, and you are somewhere in the world at the end of this long night, which is as good a place to be as any. There is a methodological problem at the center of this entire question, and it is worth naming it directly because it shapes everything that has been said so far and everything that remains to be said. The methodological problem is this: the tools that archaeology has developed to identify, date, and interpret archaeological sites were developed primarily in contexts where the material record is visible, accessible, and already partially understood. In the Mediterranean, where the classical tradition has been generating named, located, partially excavated sites for centuries, the archaeologist arrives with a map and a set of known site types and a chronological framework that provides context for every new discovery. In the American Southwest, where indigenous oral traditions about the ancestral Puebloans intersect with a rich material record of standing architecture and datable ceramics, the researcher arrives with a conceptual toolkit that has been refined over a century of systematic investigation. Even in Egypt and Mesopotamia, where the ancient civilizations were unknown to European scholars until relatively recently, the discovery process was guided from the beginning by written records, by the texts that named cities and kings and temples, and gave the researchers a framework within which to locate and interpret what they found. The boreal forest of Canada offers none of these advantages. There are no ancient texts that name the forest builders. There are no standing structures that have been above ground and visible since the time of their construction. There is no tradition of systematic survey and excavation extending back multiple centuries. The peat buries the record. The canopy obscures the surface. The distances are enormous, and the infrastructure is minimal, and the funding is insufficient, and the political will to investigate seriously has, historically, been absent. What that means in practice is that the archaeological toolkit appropriate to the boreal forest context is largely still being developed, and that the development of that toolkit has been driven less by academic institutions than by the communities whose ancestors are the subject of the inquiry. The methodology of community-based participatory research, in which indigenous knowledge holders are treated as primary researchers, rather than informants, has proven to be the most productive approach available for the boreal forest archaeological question, not because it produces better academic papers, but because it identifies the right places to look. When a Cree elder points to a specific location in the forest and says the old path is there, that statement is the product of a knowledge tradition that has been refining its understanding of that landscape for generations, possibly for millennia. It is the most precise navigational information available about that location. When a provincial archaeological survey, following that guidance, goes to the indicated location and finds a fitted stone surface under 30 centimeters of accumulated organic material, that is not merely a confirmation of the oral tradition. It is a demonstration of the methodology, a proof that the knowledge system embedded in the oral tradition is an accurate representation of the physical landscape. But that demonstration depends on someone having the funding to conduct the field survey and the institutional relationships to work with the community, and the intellectual openness to treat the oral tradition as credible geographical information rather than cultural background noise. Those requirements have not consistently been met in the history of Canadian archaeology, and the result is a record that is fragmentary, not because the landscape lacks evidence, but because the discipline has lacked the tools and the orientation to recover it. The exceptions are instructive. The James Bay Coastal Stone Arrangement Survey, which was conducted in partnership with the Mushkegowuk Cree, produced results that were both more extensive and more coherent than a survey conducted without that partnership would have produced, because the community knowledge holders knew where to look and why. The Michipicoten First Nation survey of the Algoma Highland cliff face features, which drew explicitly on community place name knowledge, identified locations of interest that no remote sensing or aerial survey would have flagged, because the features are embedded in the cliff face in ways that make them essentially invisible from any angle, except the one that the community knowledge holders, drawing on generations of lived experience with that specific landscape, knew to use. The next step, which is the step that is slowly and imperfectly being taken by a small number of researchers at the intersection of Indigenous studies, landscape archaeology, and remote sensing, is the integration of community knowledge with LiDAR survey. LiDAR, light detection and ranging, works by firing millions of laser pulses at the ground surface from an aircraft and measuring the precise return time of each pulse, building a three-dimensional model of the ground surface that, because of the density of the pulse pattern, can penetrate the canopy gaps in a forest and reveal the ground beneath. It is not perfect. In dense boreal forest with a thick understory, the canopy penetration is imperfect and ground returns can be obscured. But in the boreal forest context, where the trees are generally not as densely branched as in a tropical or temperate rainforest, LiDAR produces ground surface models that reveal features that are completely invisible from the air in conventional aerial photography. LiDAR survey of boreal forest areas in Canada is still in its early stages, concentrated in areas where there has been economic development interest, pipeline corridors, mining access roads, hydroelectric project footprints, and where the environmental assessment process has required archaeological survey of the development corridor. In those corridors, LiDAR has already produced results that were not predicted by the existing archaeological record. The Manitoba Hydro Bipole 3 Transmission Corridor Survey, conducted in the early 2010s, identified a number of linear and curvilinear ground surface features in the boreal forest sections of the corridor that were not consistent with natural terrain formation and that the surveyors could not immediately explain within the framework of known pre-contact site types. Those features were noted in the survey report and referred for assessment. The assessment process is still, as far as the available record shows, ongoing. The implications of LiDAR for the boreal forest question are potentially transformative. If the density of anomalous features revealed by the Clearwater Wildfire Survey, roughly one unclassified feature per 2 square kilometers of exposed landscape, is representative of the broader boreal forest, and if LiDAR can reveal a significant proportion of those features without waiting for wildfire to strip the organic layer, then a systematic LiDAR survey of even a portion of the Canadian boreal forest could produce a revelation of the scale that the Caracol Maya City LiDAR survey produced in 2010, when a survey of 170 square kilometers of Belizean jungle revealed a Maya urban complex vastly larger than ground survey had suggested, or the Angkor LiDAR survey, which revealed a medieval Khmer urban landscape extending far beyond the known temple complex, or the Nazca Plateau feature surveys, which discovered thousands of new geoglyphs from the air that the ground surveyors had walked past without recognizing. Those comparisons are sometimes dismissed as inappropriate because the societies that built Karakol and Angkor and the Nazca geoglyphs were, in the conventional accounting, more complex than the pre-contact societies of the Canadian boreal forest. But that dismissal is circular. The argument that those societies were more complex is based partly on the evidence of their monumental architecture, their large-scale landscape modification, their permanent built infrastructure. If the boreal forest contains evidence of monumental architecture and large-scale landscape modification and permanent built infrastructure, the argument from complexity cuts the other way. You cannot use the absence of evidence for complexity as evidence of the absence of complexity when the absence of evidence is itself a product of the failure to look. This is the epistemological trap that Canadian boreal forest archaeology has been in since the beginning of the discipline, and it is a trap that has only recently, and only partially, begun to be identified and named as such. The Prince Albert National Park in Saskatchewan provides a case study that illustrates both the potential of systematic survey and the institutional limitations that constrain it. Prince Albert National Park was established in 1927, and it has been subject to various degrees of archaeological survey since the early decades of Parks Canada administration. The park protects approximately 3,800 square kilometers of boreal forest and lake terrain in the mid-boreal zone of central Saskatchewan, and its proximity to the town of Prince Albert and its relative accessibility compared to more remote northern areas have made it one of the better surveyed stretches of boreal forest in Canada. The archaeological database for the park contains several hundred recorded sites, mostly along the lakeshore and river margins where survey is practical. In 2008, Parks Canada conducted a LiDAR survey of a portion of the park as part of a monitoring program for sensitive landforms, and the data from that survey was analysed by a Parks Canada archaeologist who was looking for evidence of known site types along the water margins. What the archaeologist found, in addition to what she was looking for, was a series of linear features in the forest interior that did not correspond to any known archaeological site type or to any known logging road or historic trail. The features were subtle, low ridges and slight surface depressions that would have been completely invisible from the ground under the forest cover, but that appeared clearly in the LiDAR-derived ground surface model as features that were not consistent with natural terrain formation processes. The archaeologist flagged these features in her analysis report and recommended ground truthing. A partial ground survey was conducted the following summer, and 2 of the 5 flagged features were confirmed as stone-lined surfaces, possible path segments, or cleared and levelled ground surfaces of unknown function. The other 3 were not reached in that survey season due to terrain and time constraints. The 2 confirmed features were assigned heritage site numbers in the Parks Canada database and designated for further study. As of the most recent annual report available, that further study has not been conducted because it is not a priority in the Parks Canada archaeological program for the park, and the features are not currently considered to be at any management risk that would elevate their priority. 2 confirmed anomalous stone features in the boreal forest of Prince Albert National Park, assigned site numbers, waiting for study that has not been scheduled and may not be scheduled in any foreseeable funding cycle. That is not an unusual situation. That is the standard situation for anomalous features in the boreal forest of Canada. They are found, they are noted, they are assigned a reference number, they wait. The waiting is not malicious. The people who manage the heritage sites database are not concealing these features. They are working with limited budgets and enormous backlogs and competing priorities, and the anomalous stone features in the boreal forest are competing for attention with the eroding fish campsites along the lakeshores, the historic cabins and trading posts that are the infrastructure of the fur trade era, the pictograph sites that are already known and already documented and already the subject of community concern. The stone features in the forest interior are, in this landscape of competing claims on limited resources, the features that wait. And so they wait, in the forest, under the lichen, in the archive, in the oral tradition of the communities that know they are there. The question of what the builders of these features intended is not one that archaeology alone can answer, even in principle. Archaeological evidence tells you what was made, and approximately when it was made, and something about how it was made and by what kind of society. It does not tell you why. The why of any human construction is a question about intention, about meaning, about the relationship between a group of people and the landscape they were transforming, and the future they were imagining would receive the product of their transformation. Those things are not material. They do not survive in stone except as inference. But the oral traditions do carry something about the why, not as explicit explanations, because oral traditions do not generally work as explicit explanations, as one-sentence summaries of the purpose of a feature. They carry the why as context, as the broader framework of meaning within which the feature makes sense, as the story within which the building of the feature was an intelligible act. And across the diverse oral traditions of the Canadian boreal forest, from the Cree and Ojibwe of the Shield, to the Innu of Labrador and Quebec, to the Athapascan peoples of the Yukon and Northwest Territories, to the Haida and Nuu-chah-nulth of the Pacific Coast, to the Dene of the Great Slave Lake Basin, to the Mi'kmaq of the Atlantic provinces, the context within which the stone features of the forest make sense is consistently a context of relationship. The features marked relationships between communities and between places, between the living world and what was understood to lie beyond or beneath or alongside the living world, between the present and the very old past, between the human knowledge of a landscape and the landscape's own knowledge of itself. That is a concept, the landscape's own knowledge of itself, that requires a different ontological framework than the one that Western scientific archaeology operates within. In the Western framework, the landscape is a material system that humans interact with. Knowledge is a property of human minds, not of the landscape. The landscape does not know anything, it does not remember, it does not have intentions or purposes. It is matter, organized by physics and biology and geology, and what meaning it has is meaning that humans impose on it. In the indigenous frameworks of the Canadian boreal forest, that is not the framework. The landscape is not merely matter, it has presence. It has history, that is not merely the history of human actions upon it, but the history of its own becoming, which is long, and which is remembered in the landscape itself, in its rock formations, and its water systems, and its flora, and its accumulated organic layers. The features that humans build in the landscape are not impositions on an inert substrate. They are contributions to an ongoing conversation between the human community and the living landscape. They are responses to what the landscape is saying, and invitations to continue the conversation. Within that framework, the stone features of the boreal forest are not monuments in the Western sense, not expressions of human power or permanence or identity. They are not memorials or territorial markers or engineering infrastructure, though they may be any of those things as well. They are, primarily, contributions to a conversation. They say something, and the landscape, which keeps them, continues to say them, in the same way that a letter continues to say what it says after the writer is gone, because the words persist, independent of the presence of the person who wrote them. What the stone features say, in this understanding, is something like, "This place was known in this way at this time." The knowing and the way and the time are all encoded in the feature itself, in its location and its orientation and its construction and its relationship to the surrounding landscape. To read the feature is to know something about the knowing that produced it, and to know the knowing is to enter, at whatever temporal remove, into the conversation that the builders were having with the landscape. The communities who have maintained oral traditions about the stone features of the boreal forest are keeping that conversation alive. They are, in a real sense, still in dialogue with the builders, still receiving and transmitting the knowledge that the builders encoded in the landscape, still present in the long conversation that the features initiated. That continuity is extraordinary. It spans periods of catastrophic disruption, of epidemic disease, and colonial violence, and forced displacement, and residential school suppression, of language and cultural practice. Through all of that, the knowledge of the features persisted, carried by elders, and passed to those who would receive it, maintained in the face of everything that tried to end it. The knowledge survived because it was treated as essential, as non-negotiable, as something that could not be allowed to perish, because its perishing would mean the perishing of the relationship between the community and the land. And the relationship between the community and the land is, in these knowledge systems, the relationship that makes community possible. You are not a community in the abstract. You are a community of this land, this forest, this lake, this ridge. You are who you are because of where you are. And where you are is a place that has been known in specific ways for a very long time. And the knowing has shaped the place, and the place has shaped the knowing, and neither exists without the other. The stone features are, in this sense, evidence not just of the people who built them, but of the relationship that made building them necessary and meaningful. They are evidence of a depth of habitation, of a length of attention, of a quality of presence that is simply incompatible with the standard account of the boreal forest as a landscape of transient human presence. The standard account says, "These people were here, but lightly, because the land was hard, and they were adapted to its hardness by moving across it rather than settling in it, leaving few traces because a light trace on the land was the adaptive advantage that allowed them to survive its demands." The stone features say, "We were here long enough and deeply enough to build in stone. We were here long enough for the lichen to grow on what we built. We were here long enough for the forest to grow over what we built, and for the peat to accumulate above what we built, and for the roots of trees that are now 400 years old to wrap themselves around what we built. We were here." The lichen says, centuries. The peat says, centuries or millennia. The tree says, at least 400 years before us, and probably much more. The stone itself says, we chose carefully. We fitted carefully. We built to last. Who builds to last? Who takes the trouble to fit stone against stone, to level a surface, to raise a wall, to terrace a hillside, to lay a road, if they are merely passing through? You build to last when you intend to be somewhere long enough that the lasting matters. You build to last when you are building for the generations that will come after you, for the community that will continue to use what you build after you are gone. You build to last when you are part of a continuity that extends backward to the people who built before you and forward to the people who will build after you. That is civilization, in the most basic and most important sense of the word, not cities. Civilization in the sense of a commitment to continuity, a decision to invest in the future, to build things that will serve people who are not yet born in a landscape that will still be here when the builders are long gone. The boreal forest of Canada was a civilization in that sense. The evidence is fragmentary and scattered and largely informal and buried under the organic accumulation of centuries, but it is there. It persists in the stone and in the oral traditions of the communities whose ancestors were part of it. And it persists in the landscape itself, which has kept what was entrusted to it faithfully for a very long time. What does it feel like to stand in that forest and know this? What does it feel like to walk across a ground that has been shaped by human hands for thousands of years? To step on a path that was there before the trees that shade you were seeds? To rest your hand on a stone that was fitted into place by someone who has been gone for 2,000 years or 4,000 years, and whose name was never written anywhere in any form that you could read? It feels like being a very late arrival at a very old gathering. It feels like coming into the middle of a conversation that has been going on for much longer than you realized, and discovering that the conversation is still happening, and that you are, despite everything, not too late to listen. The forest is dark, the stone is cold, the lichen is grey and thick and patient, and the peat is deep, and the peat remembers, in its dark, layered way, everything that fell into it and was kept, the pollen and the seeds and the wooden implements and the charcoal from fires that burned when the landscape was different and the people were different, and the knowledge of the place was kept by people who are now the oral tradition of the people who are here now. That is what the unexplained megalithic sites of Canada's forests are keeping for you, not a mystery in the sense of a puzzle waiting for a solution. A mystery in the older sense, the sense of something that reveals itself only to those who come to it in the right way, with the right preparation, with enough patience and enough silence and enough willingness to let go of the frameworks that would reduce it to something smaller than it is. The features are there, the oral traditions are there, the LiDAR data is beginning to accumulate. The community researchers are beginning to build the conceptual framework that will allow the features to be understood in their own terms, rather than in terms borrowed from other archaeological traditions. Slowly, carefully, against the resistance of institutional inertia and funding scarcity, and the accumulated weight of 150 years of looking at this landscape through the wrong lens, the picture is beginning to form, and the picture is of a forest that was not empty, that has never been empty, that has been inhabited in the deepest sense of the word, inhabited in the sense that the inhabitants shaped it and were shaped by it and built in it and were remembered by it, for as long as the landscape has been habitable and possibly longer. The stones know this, the peat knows this, the lichen knows this, the oral traditions know this, and slowly, with whatever patience and attention we can bring, we are beginning to know it too. There is a specific quality to the northern light that falls into a boreal forest clearing in the late summer, when the days have already begun to shorten and the birches have caught the first edge of yellow at their tips, and the air in the morning has a sharpness that was not there in July. It is a light that does not illuminate so much as reveal, that picks out texture rather than color, that makes the surface of a stone stand out from the organic material around it in a way that is almost photographic. It is, in a sense, the best light there is for seeing what the forest has been keeping. If you were in that light, in that clearing, in late August in the boreal forest of northern Saskatchewan, or the Kenora district of Ontario, or the Algoma Highlands above Lake Superior, and you knew what to look for, and you were willing to get down on your knees and brush aside the needle duff with your hands, you might find the stone surface that George Oldcroft's chainman found in 1907, or the platform edge that Frank Delaney measured in 1961, or the wall corner that the Manitoba Geological Survey geologist documented in 1988. You might find any of the hundreds or thousands of features that are documented only in the informal record, in the field notes and the grey literature and the oral traditions of the communities that have known about them for generations. You would not know, without the research that has not yet been done, how old it was. You would not know, without the consultation that has not yet been fully conducted, what it meant to the people who built it. You would not know, without the systematic survey that has not yet been funded, how many more features like it are within walking distance of where you are kneeling with your hands in the forest duff. But you would know that it was there. You would know that it was not natural. You would know that someone, at some point in the long past, chose this specific place in the forest, brought stone here and fitted it, and built something and left it for the forest to keep. And you would know that the forest had kept it, that the forest was keeping it still, that between the moment of building and the moment of your finding, the forest had done its job, had accumulated its layers, and grown its trees, and built its peat, and let the lichen mark the passage of centuries on the stone surface, and had brought the whole thing, intact and patient, and exactly where it was left, to this moment, this late summer afternoon, this quality of northern light, this specific person kneeling in the forest duff, with their hands brushing away the surface of years. That is a remarkable thing. It is a remarkable fact about this landscape, about what it keeps and how long it keeps it, and in what condition. The forest is not indifferent to what happens in it. It responds. It encloses. It preserves. It holds what has been placed in it with a fidelity that is, if you think about it in the right frame, something very close to care. Whether that is metaphor or something more literal depends on your ontological commitments, and this is not the place to adjudicate that question. But the functional reality is the same in either case. The forest has kept these things. It has kept them long enough and well enough that they are still there to be found. And finding them, after all this time, is a form of meeting, a meeting across the enormous distance of pre-contact time with the people who built them, who left them here, who in some sense left them for exactly this, for the person who would eventually kneel in the forest duff and brush away the years and find the stone beneath and know that they were not, in fact, late at all. The gathering is still happening, the conversation is still going, the stone is still there, exactly where it was placed, patient as the lichen that covers it, old as the forest that hides it, and present, fully and completely present, in the specific place in the specific forest where someone who knew this landscape built something intended to last. It lasted. You found it. That is the whole story, in its most compressed form, of the unexplained megalithic sites hidden beneath Canada's forests. The rest is detail, and the detail is everything, and the detail is still largely unknown, and the finding of it is the work that remains, and it is work that belongs to the communities who have been keeping the knowledge of these places for as long as anyone can account for, and to the researchers who will have the wisdom to follow where that knowledge leads, and to the forests themselves, which are keeping the evidence in the most reliable archive that has ever existed, which is stone, which is time, which is the patient dark of a northern forest that knows how to hold what it has been given and wait as long as it takes for the right person to come looking. Sleep well. The forest is patient. The stone is there. The story is long, and it is not finished, and the best parts of it are still beneath the peat, beneath the roots, beneath the lichen, waiting in the dark for the light that will reveal them. They will be there when you are ready to look. The archaeology of silence is a discipline that has not yet been named, but it is one that the Canadian boreal forest demands. It is the study of what is not in the official record, of what the gaps in the documented history of a place reveal about the assumptions and limitations and failures of the documenting practice itself. The silence in the Canadian archaeological record about the boreal forest stone features is not the silence of absence. It is the silence of inattention, of insufficient resources, of misapplied frameworks, of a discipline that arrived at its subject with expectations formed in other landscapes and found, in the boreal forest context, a landscape that did not confirm those expectations and responded by categorizing the disconfirming evidence as uncertain, as low priority, as not definitively pre-contact, as pending further research. The further research is the work of this generation and the next. It is the work that the communities have been asking for and preparing for, and in some cases conducting on their own terms for decades. It is the work that a handful of academic researchers have been doing at the margins of their disciplines, filing reports that go into grey literature archives, publishing in regional journals, speaking at conferences where their findings are received with interest and then not followed up, because the institutional structure of Canadian archaeology is not organized to follow up on findings that do not fit the existing framework. But the framework is beginning to shift. Slowly, as all paradigm shifts happen slowly, against resistance, across the careers of researchers who spend their professional lives arguing for a revision that most of their contemporaries are not yet ready to accept. The evidence accumulates, the LiDAR data accumulates, the community research accumulates, the wildfire surveys accumulate, and the oral traditions, which have been accumulating for incomparably longer than any of the other evidence streams, continue to carry what they have always carried, patiently, through everything. Consider what the cumulative evidence actually shows, assembled carefully from the sources that exist. There are stone features in the boreal forest of Canada that are not explained by natural geological processes. This is established by the accounts of geologists and foresters and surveyors and ecologists who have encountered them and described them and noted in their professional capacities that the features are not consistent with the natural processes they know. Those features are old. Their minimum age is established, in most cases, by lichen growth rates and by the age of the trees that have grown over or around them. The lichen says centuries. The trees say the same. The peat that covers many of them says the same. No one has formally dated most of them, because no one has formally investigated most of them, but the physical evidence of their age is available to anyone who visits them with the right instruments and the right training. The features are distributed across the Canadian landscape in patterns that are consistent with intentional placement rather than random accident. They appear on ridge crests and inselberg summits, and cliff faces, and tidal flats and forest clearings and river confluences. They appear, in other words, in the kinds of places that a person who was marking a landscape deliberately would choose, places that are visible, accessible to those who know how to reach them, and situated in meaningful relationship to the natural features of the terrain. The oral traditions of the indigenous communities, whose territories include these features, consistently attribute them to a period before the current cultural tradition, to a time of different people, different knowledge, different relationship to the land. They do not claim the features as their own constructions. They claim them as part of the inherited landscape, as features that were there when their ancestors arrived, and that have been incorporated into the knowledge system of the community as part of what the community knows about its land. And those oral traditions are specific. They are not vague myths about ancient builders. They are geographical information, naming specific locations, describing specific features, recording specific stories about what those features are and what they do and what relationship the community is expected to maintain with them. That specificity is exactly what you would expect from a knowledge system that has been maintained in close contact with the physical landscape for many generations. It is not the vague, mythological texture of a tradition that has lost its grounding in specific places. It is the precise geographical knowledge of a tradition that has been continuously tested against the reality of those specific places and has maintained its accuracy, because accuracy about the land is a matter of survival. The picture that these lines of evidence, taken together, produce is not a picture of a mystery in the sensational sense, not a picture of ancient aliens or lost civilizations or forbidden knowledge suppressed by powerful institutions. It is a picture of a research problem that has not been adequately resourced or adequately addressed, for reasons that are partly material and partly ideological, and that is now, slowly, beginning to receive the attention it deserves. The ideological reasons are worth pausing on, because they are the ones that are most within our power to address. The material limitations on Canadian archaeological research, the funding shortfalls, and the logistical challenges of the boreal forest landscape are real, and they are significant. But they are not the primary reason that the stone features of the boreal forest have been systematically underinvestigated for 150 years. The primary reason is an assumption that the indigenous peoples of the Canadian boreal forest did not build in stone in ways that would leave the kind of durable, extensive, systematically distributed material record that is implied by the cumulative evidence. That assumption rests on a model of boreal forest pre-contact life that was developed from a limited sample of well-documented sites, mostly along accessible water margins, mostly representing the seasonal camping and fishing and hunting activities that left the most visible surface traces, and that was generalized to the entire boreal landscape without adequate testing. When the evidence contradicts the assumption, the response has been, with rare exceptions, to question the evidence rather than the assumption. When a geologist finds a fitted stone wall in a forest and notes that it is not consistent with any natural geological process, the response is to suggest that she may have been mistaken, or that the feature is of recent origin, or that it is of uncertain character. When a forester finds a stone platform in old-growth forest and records its dimensions and its orientation, the response is to file the report and not follow up. When a survey team finds 67 unclassified stone features in a wildfire survey corridor, the response is to recommend further study and then not conduct it. The assumption is protected, not by conspiracy or malice, but by the much more ordinary and much more pervasive mechanism of institutional inertia, of the tendency of academic and governmental systems to continue doing what they have done before, to fund what has been funded before, to study what has been studied before, and to set aside as low priority the things that don't fit. The things that don't fit are, in the history of science, almost always the most interesting things. The discrepant observations, the anomalous results, the things that the existing framework cannot account for, are where new understanding comes from. Every major advance in any field of inquiry has come from taking the things that don't fit seriously enough to investigate them, to pursue them past the point of comfortable uncertainty into the uncomfortable territory where the existing framework has to be revised. The stone features of the Canadian boreal forest are things that don't fit. They are things that don't fit the model of pre-contact boreal forest life that has organized Canadian archaeology since the discipline began. And they are, for exactly that reason, the things that deserve the most serious and the most sustained attention that the discipline can bring. Because the alternative of continuing to set them aside, of continuing to note them and file them and refer them for further study that doesn't occur, of continuing to treat the oral traditions that point to them as cultural background rather than geographical information, of continuing to organize the boreal forest archaeological research program around the sites that fit the model rather than the sites that challenge it, is not neutrality. It is a choice. It is a choice to protect the existing framework from the evidence that would revise it. And that choice has a cost. The cost is knowledge. The knowledge of what was built in the Canadian boreal forest, by whom, when, and why. Knowledge that is encoded in stone and in oral tradition and in the physical landscape itself. Knowledge that belongs to the communities whose ancestors created it and to the broader human story of this continent and this species, is being lost. Not because it has been destroyed, but because it is not being recovered fast enough. The organic accumulation continues. The peat thickens by a millimeter a year. The roots of the new trees grow into the old stone and slowly lever it apart. The wildfire that revealed the 67 features in the Clearwater Corridor also destroyed the organic context that might have allowed their dating. The elder who knows the name and the story of the stone place on the ridge above the lake is another year older. The urgency is real, even if the pace of institutional response to it is not. The Wetaskiwin region of central Alberta presents an interesting case study at the margin of the boreal forest zone, in the parkland transition between the forest and the open grassland of the prairies. The Alberta parkland is a zone of mixed aspen woodland and fescue prairie that was one of the most productive and most heavily used landscapes in pre-contact Alberta, and it is also, relative to the boreal forest proper, much better documented archaeologically, because the open and semi-open terrain of the parkland is far more accessible to aerial survey and ground investigation than the dense forest to the north. In that relatively well-studied context, there is a category of feature that has been documented with enough consistency to be part of the regional typological framework, but that remains poorly understood in terms of its purpose and its cultural context. These are the cairn complexes, clusters of stone cairns arranged in patterns on elevated terrain that appear across the Alberta parkland and on the adjacent foothills terrain to the west. The individual cairns are sometimes burial cairns, sometimes vision quest markers, sometimes elements of hunting structures. But the clusters, the arrangements of multiple cairns in spatial patterns that suggest a deliberate overall design, are harder to explain within any of those functional categories. A 2011 study of cairn complexes in the Wetaskiwin-Ponoka area, conducted by the Archaeological Survey of Alberta, documented 17 cairn clusters on elevated terrain within a study corridor of about 200 square kilometers. The clusters ranged from 3 to 22 individual cairns each, distributed across the ridge crests and hilltops in patterns that the study described as possibly astronomical, in reference to the alignment of some of the cairn groupings with solar and lunar positions. The study recommended further investigation of the astronomical hypothesis, using precise surveying equipment and ethnographic research with Plains Cree and Blackfoot knowledge holders who might have relevant cultural context. The further investigation has been partially conducted. A 2015 follow-up study found that 6 of the 17 cairn clusters showed alignments with major solar or lunar events, specifically with the summer and winter solstices and with the lunar standstill cycle, at a level of precision that the study authors considered unlikely to be accidental. The other 11 clusters showed no clear astronomical alignment, which the authors interpreted as indicating that the cairn clusters served multiple purposes, not all of them astronomical, and that the clustering pattern itself, the organization of multiple cairns into a spatial group, may have been a functional type distinct from the individual cairns that are its component parts. That finding, if correct, suggests the existence in the Alberta parkland of a category of landscape feature that organized astronomical knowledge in stone at a landscape scale, marking the sky from the ground, in a way that required collaboration across multiple communities and coordination across multiple generations to create. That is a level of organizational complexity and a degree of commitment to long-term astronomical observation and recording that has no parallel in the standard model of pre-contact plains and parkland cultures, which emphasizes mobility and seasonal movement and practical knowledge of the natural world without incorporating systematic astronomical record-keeping in permanent stone structures. The Blackfoot Nation, whose traditional territory includes much of the Alberta parkland and foothills, has a sophisticated astronomical tradition that is well documented in the ethnographic literature. The Blackfoot calendar is lunar, organized around 13 moons of the year, each with a name that corresponds to a specific natural phenomenon observable in the parkland environment at that time of year. Blackfoot oral tradition includes specific references to the tracking of solstice positions and to the importance of the standstill cycle of the moon for the timing of major ceremonies. The cairn complexes of the Wetaskiwin-Ponoka area in the Blackfoot oral tradition are referred to as places of watching the sky, places where specific observations were made at specific times, places whose function was the precise recording, in stone and in the memory of those who used them, of the relationship between the landscape and the heavens above it. That tradition is consistent with the archaeological findings of the 2015 study. The cairn complexes are astronomical observatories, in the most basic sense of that term, places where the sky was watched from the ground with enough precision and enough continuity to produce a record in stone of what was observed. They are not sophisticated instrumentation systems in the European tradition of scientific astronomy. They are something different, something that integrates the observation of the sky with the occupation of a specific landscape, that uses the landscape as the instrument rather than constructing the instrument separately from the landscape. That kind of landscape-integrated astronomical observation, once you recognize it as a category of practice, appears across the Canadian landscape in ways that the standard framework of site types has not always made visible. The stone circle alignments of the prairie medicine wheel tradition are one expression of it. The cairn complexes of the Alberta parkland are another. The Inselberg summit features of northern Quebec, with their radially oriented stones pointing toward a central observation point, may be another. The high places of meeting of the Anishinaabe tradition, whose specific locations in the boreal forest correspond to elevated terrain, with long sightlines in multiple directions, may be another. The practice of watching the sky from the landscape, of using permanent stone markers to record and transmit the results of that watching, is a practice that does not require advanced technology or complex social organization in the European sense. It requires sustained attention, multi-generational knowledge transmission, and the commitment to mark the knowledge in the most durable available medium. All of these are characteristics that the oral traditions of the Canadian boreal forest and parkland communities attribute to the builders of the anomalous stone features. Whether the archaeologists are yet fully equipped to see it in the material record is a different question. The question of the relationship between the stone features of the forest and the oral astronomical traditions of the communities is one that is beginning to be addressed by researchers working at the intersection of archaeoastronomy and indigenous studies. Archaeoastronomy, as a discipline, has a complicated history in the North American context, having been the province at various points of serious researchers, enthusiastic amateurs, and sensationalists, which has made mainstream archaeology cautious about its claims and skeptical of its methods. But in recent decades, archaeoastronomy has matured as a methodology, developed more rigorous standards for testing astronomical alignment claims, and begun to produce results that even skeptical archaeological colleagues have found difficult to dismiss. The most rigorous archaeoastronomical work in the Canadian context has been conducted at the prairie medicine wheel sites, particularly at the Majorville Cairn and Medicine Wheel in southern Alberta, which is one of the oldest and largest medicine wheel sites in North America, with central cairn deposits dating to roughly 5,000 years ago. The Majorville site has been shown, through precise survey and statistical analysis, to have multiple clear astronomical alignments, including alignments with the summer solstice sunrise and with the heliacal rising of specific stars. Those alignments are too precise and too consistent to be accidental, and they have been accepted by a significant portion of the archaeological community as evidence of intentional astronomical marking in the site's design. The Majorville findings matter for the boreal forest question because they establish, at a site with good dating evidence and clear material associations, that the pre-contact peoples of the Canadian interior were capable of, and engaged in, astronomical observation sophisticated enough to be encoded in permanent stone structures. If that capacity and that practice existed at Majorville 5,000 years ago, it is reasonable to ask whether analogous practices existed in the boreal forest, where the conditions for their expression in stone are somewhat different, but not fundamentally incompatible with what is documented in the parkland. The boreal forest context presents specific astronomical opportunities and specific astronomical challenges. The canopy limits the horizon in forested terrain, which means that the open sky view necessary for solar and stellar observation requires finding the openings in the forest, the ridge crests and lake shores and elevated terrain that provide clear sightlines to the horizon. Those are precisely the locations where the anomalous stone features of the boreal forest tend to appear. The ridge crest features, and the Inselberg summit features, and the cliff top features are in the locations where a sky watcher would place an observation point, not because they are convenient for any other purpose, but because they provide the horizon view that astronomical observation requires. Whether the boreal forest features are astronomical observatories in the same sense as Majorville is a question that cannot be answered without the systematic ground survey and precise astronomical testing that has not yet been conducted. But the spatial logic of the feature distribution is consistent with that interpretation, and the oral traditions of the relevant communities include references to astronomical functions, to sky watching, to the tracking of seasonal and lunar cycles, in connection with the elevated forest stone places, that at minimum warrant serious investigation of the astronomical hypothesis. Serious investigation would require funding. It would require collaboration between archaeologists, archaeoastronomers, and community knowledge holders. It would require field time in the boreal forest in the seasons when astronomical observations are most meaningful, the solstice periods and the lunar standstill seasons. It would require the integration of LiDAR data with precise astronomical modeling to test alignment hypotheses across multiple sites simultaneously. It would require, in other words, the kind of sustained interdisciplinary community-partnered research program that has not yet been mounted for the Canadian boreal forest. It would also require a revision of the assumption that the pre-contact peoples of the boreal forest were not the kind of people who did this kind of thing. And that revision is the hardest part, not because the evidence does not support it, but because assumptions, especially assumptions embedded in the institutional practice of a discipline, do not revise easily. They require not just evidence, but a community of researchers who are willing to take the evidence seriously, to build the framework that makes the evidence intelligible, and to commit to a research program that will test the revised framework against the full complexity of the material record. That community is forming. It is forming at the intersection of Indigenous-led research programs and community-based archaeological initiatives, and the newer generation of Canadian archaeologists who have been trained in a more reflexive, intellectual tradition than their predecessors, who are less committed to the standard model not because they are credulous, but because they have seen enough of the disconfirming evidence to take it seriously. The formation of that community is slow, and its progress is uneven, and it does not have the resources it needs. But it is happening, and the stones are waiting. They will wait. They have been waiting for a very long time, and they are, as the lichen indicates, in no particular hurry. The dark of a boreal forest night is a specific dark. It is not the dark of a city with its ambient light, not the dark of an open plain where the sky gives you stars and the horizon gives you orientation. It is the dark of a closed space, a dark that closes around you in every direction, that removes the horizon and leaves you with the immediate, the close, the specific, the tree trunk 2 meters away that you can hear but not see, the sound of the lake, the sound of the wind in the upper canopy, the sound of something moving on the forest floor that stops moving when you stop moving. In that dark, the stone features of the forest are completely invisible. They are under the organic material. They are behind the trees. They are wherever they are, which is somewhere you cannot see. But they are not silent, in the sense that a thing is not silent when it is present. When its presence is a fact in the physical world, the stone features of the boreal forest are not silent. They are there. They have been there through many dark nights, through many winters, through the accumulation of centuries of dark and cold, and the slow patient work of the organic layer building above them. Being in the boreal forest at night, in the dark, with the knowledge of what is underneath the ground around you, is a very specific experience of deep time. It is not the abstract knowledge of deep time that you get from reading a geology textbook. It is the immediate, physical, sensory knowledge of a place that has been a place for much longer than any human institution or any human narrative has existed to record it. A place that was shaped by human hands, before those hands were keeping records, that was known before anyone wrote down what was known, that was home before anyone had a word for home. The stone is in that dark. The stone has been in many darks. It has been in the dark of the night, and the dark of the winter, and the dark of the decades, and the centuries, and the millennia since the people who placed it last saw it. And it has been waiting, in that specific, patient way that stone waits, for the light that will reveal it, and for the person who will be in that light, and will brush aside the years, and look down, and see what is there. You are, in a sense, that person. Not literally, not at this moment, not in the forest, but in the broader sense that engaging seriously with this story, with these accounts, and these oral traditions, and these fragmentary survey reports, and these lichen growth rates, and these tree ages, and these unanswered questions, is itself a form of looking. It is a form of attending to what is there, of taking seriously the evidence that the standard account has not taken seriously, of extending the courtesy of curiosity to a landscape, and the people who have known it, and the people who once built in it. That is all that any of this requires, at the start. Curiosity, the willingness to look, the willingness to consider that what the forest is keeping might be more significant than the history we inherited has told us to expect. From there, the work follows. The surveys and the consultations and the lichen readings and the LiDAR flights and the community partnerships and the revised frameworks and the revised histories. All of that follows from the first step, which is simply taking the evidence seriously enough to want to know what it means. The forest is enormous, and the evidence is fragmentary, and the research program is in its early stages, and most of the answers are still under the peat. But the direction is clear, and the forest, for its part, is keeping everything it has been given to keep, with perfect fidelity, until we are ready to receive it. The night is very quiet now, the trees are very still. Somewhere in the dark of the boreal forest, under a canopy that has been growing for 400 years, over a ground that has been shaped for 4,000 years, a stone is exactly where it was placed, fitted against its neighbours with the care of someone who understood that care would matter, oriented in a direction that someone understood was the right direction for a reason that has not yet been fully recovered, situated in a place that someone understood was the right place for reasons that the landscape itself encodes in its topography and its hydrology and its relationship to the sky above it. The stone is there, the knowledge is there, in fragments, in oral traditions, in the field notes of geologists and foresters and surveyors who came across things they could not explain and wrote them down in the careful, neutral language of people who did not want to be wrong about something they could not verify. The communities who have kept the longest memory of the landscape are there, with their knowledge of the specific places and the specific stories and the specific relationships between the built features and the living landscape and the ceremonial calendar and the astronomical cycles. And you are here, at the end of this long story, in whatever room or field or forest you have found to listen to it in. It is late. The dark is around you, in whatever form it takes, in the place where you are. And somewhere, under a forest you may never visit, there is stone that was placed there by someone who is now the deepest kind of past, someone who has been gone so long that their name is not in any record anywhere, who is remembered only in the stone and in the landscape and in the knowledge systems of the communities that have chosen, through everything, to continue knowing them. That is a remarkable thing to carry in the mind while sleep comes. That you are part of a chain of human presence in this landscape that extends back much further than the history books say, that the continent you are in has been known and shaped and inhabited and built in by people whose work is still here, under the forest, under the peat, under the lichen, waiting to be found and understood and incorporated into the account of what has happened here, which is the account of what we are and where we come from and how long we have been here and what we have done with our time in the world. The forest is patient. It is very patient. It has been keeping its secrets for a very long time, and it will keep them until the time is right for them to emerge, which is a patience that puts our own impatience into a perspective that is, at this hour, at this point in the long night, quietly comforting. Sleep well. The stone is in the forest is in the dark, and the dark is full of things that are there, patient and old and present, waiting with the patience of stone for the moment when we are ready to receive what they have been keeping. That moment is coming. It may already be here, in the surveys and the oral tradition consultations and the LiDAR flights and the community research programs that are, slowly, finding the things that the forest has been keeping. Or it may be a little further away, waiting for the next generation of researchers with better tools and different assumptions and the wisdom to follow where the knowledge leads. Either way, the stone will be there. It has always been there. It will be there in the morning, when the light comes back to the forest, when the lichen catches the first low sun and glows its subtle grey-green on the surface of the fitted stone, and a person who knows how to look is there to see it. That person might be you. That morning might be closer than you think. The forest is patient. The stone is there. The story is not finished. Rest now, and in the morning, look down. The things you are looking for have been waiting for you for a very long time. There is a place in the Algonquin Highlands of Ontario, not far from the eastern boundary of Algonquin Provincial Park, where the Canadian Shield rises to a series of rounded granite summits that look, from a distance, like the heads of enormous sleeping animals half submerged in the sea of boreal forest around them. These summits are not high in absolute terms. None of them exceeds 600 meters above sea level, but they rise steeply from the surrounding lake and forest terrain, and their upper surfaces are exposed bedrock, scoured clean by the last glaciation, and since colonized by a thin layer of soil and hardy boreal plants, lichens and sedges and dwarf spruce that cling to the rock surface in defiance of the wind and the cold. From the top of these summits, on a clear day, you can see 30 or 40 kilometers in every direction. You can see the chain of lakes that runs through the heart of the highlands, the distinctive blue of the deep shield lakes that have no inlet or outlet visible from above, the dark of the forest between them, the occasional pale slash of a logging road from an era of industrial forestry that ended decades ago and whose traces the forest is slowly reclaiming. You can see, on the clearest days, the faint smear of haze that marks the agricultural lowlands to the south and west, the transition zone where the shield gives way to the limestone platform, and the soils deepen and the forest thins, and the human density increases to levels that the shield itself cannot support. From those summits, in other words, you can see the whole landscape. You can see the relationship between the water and the rock and the forest. You can see the roots that move naturally through the terrain, the valleys and the lake chains and the portage corridors that have channeled human movement through these highlands for thousands of years. You can see, if you know what you are looking at, the logic of the landscape, the way the terrain organizes the possibilities of human life within it. A person who spent years on those summits, watching, would develop an understanding of that landscape that no map and no aerial photograph could fully replicate. They would understand the way the weather builds over specific hills and descends through specific valleys. They would understand the seasonal movements of the animals along the ridgelines and through the wetlands. They would understand the acoustic properties of the landscape, the way sound carries across the lakes and through certain forest corridors, the way the hills create shadows of silence in their lee. They would understand the astronomical opportunities that the specific geometry of each summit provides, the precise arc of the sun across the sky in each season, the specific point on the horizon where the summer solstice sun rises when seen from each elevated position. That understanding, accumulated over generations of observation from those summits, would be the most accurate and the most complete knowledge of the Algonquin Highlands that has ever existed. It would be in the minds and the bodies and the practices of the people who accumulated it, and it would be encoded in the most durable, available medium, in the stone features that those people built on the summits to mark the results of their observation, to make the knowledge portable in the sense that a permanent physical marker is portable, carrying its information forward in time to whoever comes to the right place in the right season and knows how to read what is there. A 1,997 survey conducted by the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources as part of a natural heritage assessment for the Algonquin Park buffer zone documented several stone features on the exposed summit surfaces of 3 of these highland ridges. The features were described in the survey report as possible indigenous cultural features consisting of upright stones and stone arrangements of unknown age and function. The report noted that the features had not been brought to the attention of the First Nations communities with traditional connections to the area and recommended that this consultation be conducted before any further assessment. Management decisions were made. The consultation was conducted by a heritage consulting firm retained for the purpose, and the results were reported in a supplement to the original survey document filed in 1999. The supplement records that Algonquin First Nations knowledge holders, when shown photographs of the summit features and informed of their locations, identified them as places of watching and deliberation, elevated places where specific kinds of ceremonial and practical knowledge work was done, places whose use extended back before the oldest oral traditions of the Algonquin people into the time of the ones who were there before them. The supplement recommended further survey of the summit features and formal documentation in consultation with Algonquin First Nations. As far as the available record shows, that recommendation was incorporated into the park management plan as a long-term priority, which means that it has not been actively implemented, but is available to be funded if the resources and the will converge. The summit features of the Algonquin Highlands are in that limbo, known and noted and referred for further study and weighting, that characterizes so many of the boreal forest stone features in the Canadian archaeological record. They are not unknown, they are not forgotten, they are just not studied, not yet, not with the resources and the intent and the community partnership that would make the study meaningful. The reason this specific example is worth dwelling on is that the Algonquin Highlands are not remote. They are not in the deep boreal, far from any infrastructure. They are 3 hours from Toronto. They are accessible by paved highway. They have been visited by millions of people as a recreational area. They have been the subject of sustained naturalistic and ecological research for decades. They are, in the Canadian context, about as accessible and as well-studied a boreal landscape as exists. And yet the stone features on their summits are unexcavated, undated, inadequately documented, and essentially unknown outside the small number of survey reports and consultation documents that reference them. If that is the situation in the Algonquin Highlands, 3 hours from Canada's largest city, the situation in the remote boreal north is considerably more stark. The Birch Mountains of northern Alberta are an elevated plateau, rising to about 900 meters above the surrounding Peace River lowland, that straddles the boundary between the boreal forest and the subarctic landscape to the north. The Birch Mountains are known primarily as a geographical feature and as the location of a provincial wilderness area, the Birch Mountains Wilderness Area, established in 2000. They are not known as an area of significant pre-contact archaeological activity, which is itself a statement about the state of the archaeological knowledge of the area, because the absence of documented sites is a function of the absence of survey rather than of actual absence of features. In 2003, a crew of oil sands industry workers building a seismic line through the Birch Mountains encountered a series of stone features on an exposed ridge crest that they photographed and reported to their company archaeologist. The company archaeologist visited the site and documented what she described as a linear arrangement of upright stones, approximately 40 meters long, consisting of 12 to 15 individual stones set at roughly regular intervals, with the stones roughly aligned along the ridge crest in a direction that the archaeologist noted was approximately north-south. She noted lichen development on the stones consistent with considerable age and recommended that the site be formally assessed before any further seismic work was conducted in the vicinity. The assessment was conducted, and the assessing archaeologist concluded that the feature was of possible pre-contact indigenous origin, possibly a vision quest marker or a hunting structure, but that its age and specific cultural affiliation could not be determined without further investigation. The site was assigned a heritage site number in the Alberta Archaeology Database, and the seismic line was rerouted to avoid it. The feature is now a numbered heritage site, sitting on its ridge crest in the Birch Mountains, assigned a number, rerouted around, not studied. The Woodland Cree and Dene Thar communities, whose traditional territories include the Birch Mountains, were consulted during the assessment, and their knowledge holders provided information about the general significance of elevated ridge terrain in the area as places of spiritual importance and ceremonial use, but were not asked specifically about the linear stone arrangement, and no elder was taken to the site to provide context for the specific feature. That gap, the gap between the consultation that was conducted and the consultation that would have been most informative, is typical of the assessment process as it currently operates. The consultation is required by provincial heritage legislation, but the legislation does not specify what form the consultation must take or what questions must be asked. In practice, the consultation often consists of a meeting with community representatives and a request for information about the general cultural significance of the area, rather than a collaborative investigation of the specific feature with the knowledge holders who would be most likely to have relevant context. A consultation that took an elder to the specific ridge and showed them the specific stones and asked them to tell the story of that place, if there was a story to tell, would be a fundamentally different consultation from the one that is typically conducted. It would take more time, require more logistical support, and depend on the existence of an elder with the relevant knowledge who is willing and able to make the trip. All of those conditions are not always met, for practical reasons. But when they are met, when that specific consultation happens, the results are consistently more informative and more significant than the results of the typical office meeting. The Woodland Cree word for the kind of knowledge that an elder has about a specific place in the landscape, the knowledge that comes from generations of relationship with that place, from the accumulated experience of the community with its specific features and its specific stories and its specific role in the ceremonial and practical life of the community, has been translated variously as traditional knowledge, as traditional ecological knowledge, as indigenous knowledge, as land-based knowledge. All of those translations capture something real about the knowledge, but none of them captures the most important thing about it, which is that it is specific. It is not general knowledge about boreal forest ecology or general knowledge about indigenous ceremonial practices. It is knowledge about this ridge, this stone, this place, this story. That specificity is the most valuable thing it has to offer to the archaeological investigation of the Canadian boreal forest. The academic archaeology of the region produces general knowledge, knowledge about site types and chronological frameworks and cultural sequences and regional patterns. The community knowledge produces specific knowledge, knowledge about individual places, their names, their stories, their roles in the lives of the communities that have known them for the longest time. The combination of the two, the general framework and the specific knowledge, is what produces the kind of understanding that neither can achieve alone. The researchers who have been working at that intersection, in the boreal forest context, for the last 2 or 3 decades, report consistently that the combination is not merely additive, that the specific knowledge does not just fill in details within the general framework. The specific knowledge revises the framework, because what the oral traditions say about specific places frequently turns out to be incompatible with what the general framework predicts about those places. The oral tradition says, the old path is here. The general framework says, there should be no path here. The field survey finds the fitted stone surface. The general framework has to be revised. That pattern of revision, community knowledge pointing to features that the general framework did not predict, has occurred often enough in the available record to be a pattern rather than a series of coincidences. It is the pattern that argues most strongly for the systematic integration of community knowledge into the Boreal Forest Archaeological Research Program, not as a courtesy or as a legal requirement, but as a primary research method, as the most efficient available approach to finding the things that the landscape is keeping. The things that the landscape is keeping are, the evidence suggests, numerous and significant. They are not relics of a simple culture doing simple things in a simple landscape. They are the products of a sophisticated engagement with a demanding landscape over a very long time, an engagement that produced architectural complexity, astronomical knowledge, landscape-scale organization, an enduring material culture in stone that has outlasted everything else that was part of the culture that produced it. What has not outlasted is the name. The name of the people who built the road that Aldcroft's team found in 1907. The name of the people who raised the platform in the Kenora Old Growth that Delaney measured in 1961. The name of the people who fitted the wall on the Grass River Ridge that the Manitoba Geological Survey geologist documented in 1988. The name of the people who terraced the Haida Gwaii hillsides in a way that the 400-year-old trees have grown over and around. The name of the people who marked the Yukon Ridge crests with their upright stone arrangements and then became, in the oral tradition of those who came after, simply the old ones, the ones who were there before, the first people. The loss of the name is not nothing. The name is part of the knowledge. The name carries the connections to the language and the other names in that language and the cosmological framework within which the names make sense and the social structure within which the knowledge was held and transmitted. The loss of the name is a loss of a dimension of the knowledge that the physical features cannot replace. But the physical features remain. The knowledge held by the communities that have maintained their relationship with the landscape that contains the features remains. And the research that is slowly, incompletely, underfundedly building the framework that will allow the features and the community knowledge and the oral traditions and the physical evidence to be understood as parts of a coherent whole, that research remains. What remains, after the name is lost, is what the people built. What they built is in the forest. What is in the forest is old. What is old is patient. And patience, in the end, is what the boreal forest teaches everyone who spends enough time in it. The canopy closes over you. The light changes. The peat gives softly under your feet. And somewhere nearby, under the organic accumulation of 100 or 1,000 or 5,000 years, a stone is resting against another stone in the precise configuration that a pair of human hands placed it, on a day that is now so far in the past that no calendar we have could reach back to name it, in a landscape that has changed in every particular except the underlying stone, which is still the same stone, still fitted as it was fitted, still carrying whatever information its placement was meant to carry, still waiting, with the patience that only stone has, for the moment when someone will come and look and understand. The moment is not yet fully here, but it is coming. Sleep well, dream of the forest, dream of the stone in the dark of the forest, and the lichen on the stone, and the years accumulating like snowfall on the surface of the peat and the forest floor, layer on layer, season on season, the organic record of time passing in a landscape that holds its history more faithfully than any archive we have built. Dream of the people who placed the stone, who chose this place and this orientation and this material, and put their knowledge into the physical world in the most durable form available to them, which is the form that has survived everything else, and is there still in the dark, in the forest, patient as the lichen, old as the hills. You are part of that story too, the long story of human beings paying attention to the landscape they are in, marking what they find, trying to leave something for those who will come after them. The stone is one form of that effort. This story, which you have carried with you through this long night, is another. The story is in you now. Carry it gently. Give it room to settle into the landscape of your mind, the way the organic matter settles into the forest floor, layer by layer, finding its place in the accumulation of everything that has come before. And in the morning, if you wake with questions, if you wake with a curiosity about the forests, you know, and the stones that might be in them, and the people who might have placed those stones in the deep past of the place where you are, follow that curiosity. It is taking you somewhere real. The forest is real, the stone is real, the story is real. And somewhere in the dark of the Canadian forest, right now, while you sleep, the lichen is continuing its slow work on the surface of a stone that was placed there by someone who is now only the stone. And the stone is patient, and the forest is patient, and both of them are waiting for the light. The eastern shore of Georgian Bay, the large arm of Lake Huron that cuts into the Ontario Shield, is one of the most dramatically beautiful coastlines in North America, a fractal edge of granite outcrops and pine-covered islands and clear cold water that the Group of Seven made famous, and that, in the century since, has become one of the most visited recreational landscapes in Canada. The Canadian Shield plunges into the bay here in a series of rounded domes and vertical faces that the glaciers scoured to their present form, and that the lake has been undercutting ever since, creating an ever-shifting edge between land and water that is, on the geological timescale, still in rapid flux. What the recreational landscape of Georgian Bay conceals, under its famous beauty, is a pre-contact history that extends back to the earliest human habitation of the Great Lakes region, to the post-glacial period when the first people followed the retreating ice north along the lake margins and found this coast, this clear water, this extraordinary abundance of fish and game and plant resources, and stopped. They did not merely pass through. This coast was a destination, a place where people came and stayed and built communities and developed cultural traditions that have persisted, in continuous if transformed form, to the present. The archaeological record of the Georgian Bay coast is reasonably well documented relative to the boreal forest interior because the coast is accessible and has been the subject of sustained academic and cultural heritage investigation since the 19th century. The record includes Huron-Wendat sites, Odawa sites, much older Laurentian archaic sites along the lake margins, and, at the very bottom of the documented sequence, evidence of the earliest post-glacial occupation of the region, sites that represent the first human communities to inhabit the newly deglaciated landscape. But the record is concentrated, as it always is, on the accessible margins, the lakeshore and the river mouths and the portage corridors. The interior of the Georgian Bay watershed The shield uplands behind the coast, the rocky forested terrain that rises steeply from the lake margin and forms the backdrop to the famous coastal scenery, is much less documented. And in that less documented interior, the pattern that has been described throughout this account reasserts itself. In 1984, a team from the Royal Ontario Museum, conducting a survey of pre-contact sites in the Muskoka district, which lies in the Georgian Bay hinterland, documented a series of stone features on exposed shield outcrops in the survey area. The features were described as stone circles, ranging from 3 to 8 meters in diameter, constructed of granite fieldstones laid in single or double courses at ground level, with interiors that were clear of the organic accumulation that covered the surrounding terrain. The survey team documented 11 of these circles within a survey corridor of roughly 50 square kilometers, a density that the team noted was higher than they had anticipated based on the site database for the region. The Royal Ontario Museum report recommended further investigation, proposing a more intensive survey of the wider region to determine the spatial extent of the stone circle distribution, and a radiocarbon dating program at one or more of the circles. The further investigation was proposed in the context of a funding application that, as the subsequent file record shows, was not successful. The 11 stone circles, documented in 1984, remain in the Ontario Archaeological Sites database as recorded sites awaiting further study. In the years since that survey, a small number of other researchers working in the Muskoka and Haliburton regions of the Georgian Bay hinterland have documented additional stone circles and related features, building a body of grey literature documentation that collectively points to a significant and widespread tradition of stone circle construction in the Georgian Bay watershed. A 2004 survey by a consulting firm conducting assessment work for a cottage development documented 7 additional circles in the Haliburton Highlands, and a 2009 survey by a researcher affiliated with Laurentian University documented 4 more in the Muskoka Lakes area. None of these surveys has been followed by excavation or formal dating. The Anishinaabe communities of the Georgian Bay region, primarily the Ojibwe-speaking nations of the Lake Huron shoreline and the Chippewa of Saugeen, have oral traditions that speak of the shield territories behind the coast as lands of deep history, places where the relationship between the Anishinaabe people and the land was established in the very early time of their presence in the region. The stone circles, when shown photographs by researchers conducting consultation, are identified by some knowledge holders as council places, places where the community gathered for deliberation and ceremony, and by others as places of the Old Ones, which, in the Anishinaabe context, refers to beings or communities that preceded the current Anishinaabe cultural tradition on the land. That ambiguity, council places versus places of the Old Ones, reflects a genuine uncertainty in the oral tradition about whether these features are the products of the current cultural tradition or of something that preceded it. That uncertainty is itself informative. It suggests that the stone circles are old enough that the oral tradition does not carry specific memory of their construction, that they belong to a period before the continuous oral record that the community maintains, a period so distant that the circles have become part of the received landscape rather than part of the received history. How old is that? The lichen on the Georgian Bay hinterland circles suggests, at minimum, several centuries of development. The circles are not recent constructions. They predate the recorded contact period. But whether they predate it by 200 years or 2,000 years is not something the lichen can determine, because lichen growth rates vary too much between microhabitats to allow precise dating at that scale of precision. A radiocarbon date on charcoal from the interior of one of the circles would provide a much tighter answer. A radiocarbon date from the interior of 11 circles would provide a robust estimate of the period of circle construction in the region. Neither has been obtained. The absence of that basic dating evidence is, at this point in the discussion, perhaps the most telling detail of all. The Georgian Bay hinterland stone circles have been known in the formal archaeological record since 1984. They are documented in the provincial site database. They are not exotic or remote. They are in cottage country, within a few hours of Toronto. And yet, 40 years after their formal documentation, their age is unknown because no one has organized the funding or the research program to find out. The explanation for that is not that archaeologists are uninterested or that the sites are not significant. The explanation is structural. The current system of archaeological research in Canada, which depends heavily on development-related assessment, which is conducted by consulting firms at the requirement of developers and funded by development budgets, is poorly suited to producing basic research on sites that are not in the path of any development, and that represent categories of features that are not yet part of the standard typological framework that assessment archaeologists are equipped to study. The stone circles of the Georgian Bay hinterland fall into that gap. They are not being developed. They are not in the path of anything. They are just sitting there in the forest, on their shield outcrops, surrounded by lichen and years, waiting for someone with a research mandate and a dating budget to come and find out how old they are. The Abitibi region of northern Quebec and northern Ontario, centered on Lake Abitibi and the Abitibi River drainage, is another example of a moderately accessible boreal forest region with a fragmentary archaeological record that hints at more than has been formally documented. The Abitibi region was one of the first areas of northern Ontario and Quebec to be surveyed for mineral resources in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and the mining history of the region has produced, as a byproduct, a number of informal accounts of anomalous features encountered during exploration and development activity. Among those accounts is a 1934 report by a geological assistant named Thomas Archambault, whose field notes from a survey in the Abitibi district that summer describe an encounter with what he called a worked stone surface in the forest north of the town of Abitibi. Archambault was a trained geologist working for the Ontario Department of Mines, and his observation that the surface was worked, meaning shaped or prepared by human action, was the observation of someone with professional training in the distinction between natural and artificial rock modification. He noted the feature in his field notes, described its location and approximate extent, and recommended that it be brought to the attention of the provincial archaeology authorities. The recommendation appears in the Geological Survey report for the 1934 Abitibi season, buried in a section on miscellaneous observations, and there is no record that it was ever acted upon. The feature Archambault described, a worked stone surface in the boreal forest north of Abitibi, is one of the observations that the 2009 survey of Quebec Shield archaeology cited as part of the accumulating body of informal evidence for pre-contact stone working in the Shield boreal zone. It has not been the subject of any formal follow-up investigation. The Algonquin and Cree communities of the Abitibi region, whose territories overlap in this area and who have coexisted and interacted for many generations, both have oral traditions that reference old places in the Abitibi forest, places where something was built or done by people before the current communities were the current communities. Those traditions are not specific in the way that the Cree Grass River traditions or the Innu Mealy Mountain traditions are specific. They are generalized references to a past that the community acknowledges without fully knowing, a time beyond the reach of living oral memory. But the generalized reference is consistent with the pattern that has been observed throughout this account, in that the Abitibi region's indigenous communities, like the communities of the Shield and the boreal forest everywhere, carry in their oral tradition an acknowledgement that the landscape they inhabit is older than their habitation of it, that things were done in it before they came to it, and that those things are part of the landscape that they have inherited. What is left, at the end of all this evidence, at the end of the Oldcroft field notes, and the Delaney forestry logs, and the Thibodeau geological reports, and the Blevins provincial archaeology surveys, and the Laramie Inselberg overflights, and the many forestry inventory, and the Whitaker Pelly Mountains documentation, and the Prince Albert Park LiDAR data, and the Clearwater Wildfire Survey results, and the Royal Ontario Museum Stone Circle reports, and the Archambault 1934 geological notes, and the James Bay Coastal Ridge surveys, and the Birch Mountains oil sands seismic discovery, and the Algonquin Highlands summit consultation report, and the Great Slave Lake shoreline inventory, and the Georgian Bay hinterland circle documentation, is a picture. The picture is of a continent that was inhabited for a very long time by people who were not simply passing through, who built things, who marked things, who organized the landscape according to a knowledge system that was sophisticated enough to encode its results in stone and to distribute those encoded results across thousands of kilometers of terrain in patterns that reflect a coherent, spatial logic. Who maintained that knowledge system over generations long enough to produce not just scattered individual features, but a landscape-scale system of marks and structures and observation points and pathways that is, when you look at it in its totality, the product of a civilization in the fullest sense. Not a civilization in the European sense of cities and writing and states and markets. A civilization in the deeper sense, the sense that predates all of those specific cultural forms, the sense of a community of communities organized around a shared relationship with a shared landscape, transmitting knowledge across generations, investing in the future, leaving marks for those who would come after. Those marks are in the forest. The forest is keeping them. The communities who know the forest are keeping the knowledge of them. And the research that is beginning, tentatively and underfundedly, and against the resistance of a century and a half of institutional inertia to bring those two sources of knowledge together, is beginning to produce a picture that is larger and older and more humanly significant than anything the standard account of pre-contact Canadian history has prepared us to expect. The standard account says, the boreal forest was thinly populated by mobile hunter-gatherers who left few traces. The evidence says, the boreal forest was inhabited by people who built in stone, who marked the landscape systematically, who maintained astronomical observation points on exposed ridge crests and Inselberg summits, who constructed platforms and enclosures and walls and roads and terraces across thousands of square kilometers of terrain, and who left those constructions in the care of the forest, which has kept them faithfully for a very long time. The evidence is fragmentary. The research is incomplete. The dating is almost entirely undone. The cultural affiliation of most features is unknown. The relationship between the different regional traditions of stone construction is unestablished. There is enormous work to be done, but the direction of that work is clear, and the first step of it, the step of taking the evidence seriously, of treating the field notes and the oral traditions and the lichen growth rates and the tree ages as real data pointing toward real features in the real landscape, that step has been taken by the researchers whose work has been cited here, by the communities whose knowledge has been preserved here, and by everyone who has read this far and is now carrying, in whatever form it takes in the mind at the end of a long night, the beginning of a different understanding of what happened here, in the forests of Canada, in the deep time before the record we inherited begins. That understanding is still forming. It is incomplete. It has gaps the size of provinces. It has questions the size of the boreal forest itself, which is very large. But it is real, and it is growing, and the people who are doing the work of growing it are doing it with the seriousness and the rigor and the community partnership that it deserves. And the stone is in the forest, and the forest is patient. And somewhere in the dark of the boreal night, the lichen is growing on the fitted granite, a millimeter slower than the years, precise and faithful, and entirely indifferent to whether anyone is watching. Someone is watching. Someone has always been watching. That is, perhaps, the oldest and the most important thing that the stone features of Canada's forests have to tell us about the people who built them. They were paying attention. They paid attention for long enough, and carefully enough, and with enough respect for the knowledge they were accumulating, and enough commitment to passing it forward, that what they knew is still here, in the stone and in the oral tradition and in the landscape itself, available to anyone who comes with the willingness to be as patient as the lichen, as attentive as the surveyors who wrote down what they found in neutral, careful language, because there was no other language for it, as honest as the forest, which keeps what it is given and does not pretend to keep what it has lost. Pay attention to the stone, pay attention to the lichen, pay attention to the oral traditions of the communities who have been paying attention to this landscape since before the standard account of Canadian history begins. Pay attention to the questions that don't have answers yet, and resist the comfortable assumption that the absence of an answer means the absence of a thing. The things are there, the forest is keeping them, and the darkness, at the end of this long night of stories and stones and patient accumulation, is not the darkness of emptiness. It is the darkness of something very full, very old, very present, waiting with the patience of stone for the light that will reveal it. Sleep now. The stone is in the forest. The forest is in the dark. The dark is full of things that are there, patient and old and present, carrying forward through all the years the knowledge that was placed in them by hands that are now the deepest past, waiting for the hands that will eventually find them and know them and understand what they have been keeping. Good night. The stone is patient. The forest is patient. The story will be here in the morning, and so will the stone, and so will the forest, and so will you. Awake in the light of a morning that belongs, like every morning, to a landscape that has been inhabited and marked and known and loved for much longer than the history we inherited is willing to say. The question of stone as a medium of communication is worth considering more directly than it has been so far in this account, because it is central to understanding why the features discussed here matter in ways that go beyond their archaeological significance. Every other medium of communication that human beings have used decays. Wood decays, bone decays, leather decays, plant fibers decay. Even the most durable organic materials, given enough time and the right conditions, return to the earth. The human voice decays the moment it is spoken, persisting only in the memory of those who heard it, and in their ability to transmit what they heard to others who can transmit it further. Writing preserves, but writing requires the survival of specific materials and the persistence of the knowledge system that can decode it. A clay tablet in a dead language is not communication. It is an artifact waiting to be read by someone who can reconstruct the code. Stone is different. Stone does not require decoding in the same way. A fitted stone surface is a fitted stone surface across any cultural boundary and any temporal distance. The fact of its having been fitted is legible without translation to any person who looks at it and knows the difference between a natural rock surface and a worked one. The stone communicates, across whatever distance of time, separates the builder from the finder, a single non-negotiable fact. I was here, and I did this, deliberately, with intention. That is a minimal communication. It does not say who, or when, or why, but it is a communication that stone makes with extraordinary fidelity across extraordinary distances of time. The fitted stones of Stonehenge communicate the fact of their fitting across 5,000 years. The stepped platforms of Chichen Itza communicate the fact of their construction across 1,000 years. The shaped stone of the boreal forest features communicates the same fact across whatever years separate us from the hands that did the shaping. The minimum content of that communication is, a person was here, had knowledge, exercised that knowledge in the physical world, and left the result in the most durable available medium. That is already more than nothing. It is already more than the standard account of the Canadian boreal forest attributes to the people who were here before the record begins. The maximum content of that communication, which requires the oral tradition and the landscape knowledge, and the community relationship with the specific places to decode, is something much richer. It is the astronomical alignment and the ceremonial significance and the knowledge of materials and the social coordination that large stone construction requires, and the multi-generational commitment that the scale of the material, landscape-wide distribution implies. But that maximum content is there, in the features, waiting for the interpretive work that will decode it, which is the work of the researchers and the communities and the LiDAR operators and the lichen counters and the tree ring readers, and everyone else who brings their specific tool to the specific problem of understanding what the boreal forest has been keeping. The work is real, the features are real, the knowledge is real. The only question is whether we will do the work of connecting them, of building the interpretive framework that will allow the features to tell us what they know. That framework will not be built quickly. The Canadian boreal forest is very large, and the number of researchers who are equipped and funded to work on this question is very small. The timeline for building the framework is probably generational, meaning that the picture we will have in 30 years will be substantially more complete than the picture we have now, but the picture we have now is already enough to make the basic case, which is that something significant was built in the Canadian forest in the deep pre-contact past, and that something significant is still there, and that the work of understanding it has barely begun. What that means for anyone who is listening to this account, anyone who has followed the thread from Oldcroft's chainman in the Manitoba forest in 1907 to the lichen growing on the Georgian Bay hinterland stone circles tonight, is that this is a story in the middle of itself. It is not a story about something that has been found and understood. It is a story about something that is being found, slowly and imperfectly, against the resistance of institutional inertia and funding scarcity and the accumulated weight of a model that did not predict what the evidence is showing. It is a story about the process of understanding, which is always slower than the urgency of the thing being understood demands. The urgency is real. The elders who hold the specific place knowledge are aging. The forest itself is changing, as the boreal zone responds to a warming climate with altered fire regimes and shifting tree species ranges that will, in the coming decades, create new exposures in some areas and cover others more deeply. The seismic lines and the pipeline corridors and the logging roads that now occasionally reveal features will, if the development rate in the boreal zone continues to increase, create more opportunities for discovery, but also more risks of destruction. The window for systematic, protective, community-partnered investigation of the boreal forest's archaeological legacy is not unlimited. But the stone is patient. The stone has been patient through everything that has happened to the boreal landscape in the last 10,000 years, since the ice retreated, through the post-glacial reorganization of the forest, through the coming and going of cultural traditions, through the epidemic losses of the contact period, through the industrial era of logging and mining and pipeline construction and road building and seismic surveying that has left its traces in every part of the boreal forest. The stone has survived all of that with perfect equanimity, because stone does not have a choice about surviving. It simply persists in the form it was given until a force strong enough to change it arrives. No such force has arrived for most of the forest stone features discussed in this account. They are where they were placed. They are in the same fitted configuration, or close to it, that they were in when the last person who understood them was alive. They have acquired the lichen and the organic accumulation and the tree roots and the peat overlay that centuries of boreal forest process have placed over them, and they have waited through all of that. They are still waiting. The story of the unexplained megalithic sites of Canada's forests is, at its most essential, a story about persistence, about what persists and what does not. The name of the builders did not persist. The language in which they talked about what they were building did not persist. The specific ceremonies and the specific astronomical knowledge and the specific social institutions that organized the building did not persist in any directly recoverable form. The community relationships that maintained the knowledge of the specific features through the contact period and beyond persisted in some forms and were broken in others. The oral traditions that encode geographical information about the features persisted with remarkable tenacity in some communities and were suppressed or disrupted in others. What persisted perfectly, with no degradation and no ambiguity, is the stone. The stone is exactly what it was. It has not become something else. It has not been redefined or reinterpreted or adjusted to fit a changing framework. It is the same fitted granite, in the same fitted configuration, in the same place, in the same forest, and it will be the same fitted granite, in the same fitted configuration, in the same place, in the same forest, or what remains of the same forest, for a very long time to come. That persistence is, in a sense, the original intention of building in stone. You build in stone when you want what you build to outlast you, when you want it to be there for the people who come after, whoever they are and whenever they come, when you want to leave a mark in the landscape that will still be legible when everything else you left is gone. The people who built the stone features of the Canadian boreal forest wanted to leave a mark that would last, and they did. The mark lasted. It outlasted them. It outlasted their language and their culture and their names, and in many cases their oral traditions. It outlasted everything except the landscape itself and, in attenuated and transformed but real form, the communities that have maintained a relationship with that landscape through everything. The mark is still there. We are the ones who are coming after, the ones the builders could not have imagined in any particular, but for whom they built, in the general sense that you build for the future when you build in stone. We are the audience the stone has been waiting for, or one generation of it, one in the long series of generations that have stood in the forest and looked down and seen the stone and tried to understand what it means. We are not the last of that audience. After us, there will be others, with better tools and more complete oral traditions and more thoroughly developed interpretive frameworks, and, perhaps, the institutional resources and the political will to conduct the systematic survey that this landscape deserves. Those researchers will find more than we have found. they will understand more of what they find. The picture they will have will be larger and more coherent, and more humanly profound than the picture we have now. But the picture we have now is already remarkable. It is already enough to say, something significant happened here, in this forest, before the history we inherited begins. People built things here that have lasted. The things are still here. The communities who have maintained the longest relationship with the landscape that contains them are still here. The work of understanding what they built and why is underway, and it is producing a revision of the story of the pre-contact Canadian past that is, for anyone who is paying attention, quietly extraordinary. The boreal forest of Canada is not empty. It has never been empty. It is full of the past, full of the evidence of a habitation that the standard account has systematically underestimated, full of stone and lichen and oral tradition, and the patient accumulation of the years over everything that was built and left here for the future to find. The future is finding it. You are part of the future that the builders were building for. And the stone is there, patient and fitted and exactly where it was placed, waiting in the dark of the boreal forest for the light that will reveal it, and for the hand that will brush away the years, and for the eye that will look and understand. That eye is yours. Or it could be. The forest is not far. The stone is in the forest. The story has been going on for a very long time, and it is not finished, and the next chapter of it is being written right now, in the field notes of the researchers, and the knowledge of the elders, and the data of the LiDAR surveys, and the testimony of the lichen, which grows on the stone at a rate that is slower than patience, and more certain than any calendar we have made. Sleep. The stone will be there when you wake. The forest will be there. The story will be there. And somewhere in the dark, the lichen is growing, one more increment on the slow clock of the stone, counting the years between the hand that placed it and the hand that will one day find it and know it for what it is. That day is coming, that hand is forming, that knowing is in the world, already, in fragments, building toward the coherence that the evidence deserves. The forest is patient. You can afford to be patient too. The stone is not going anywhere. Good night. One more thread to follow before the night is fully done, because this story has a geography that extends to places this account has not yet reached, and those places deserve their moment in the telling. The Pacific Ranges of British Columbia, the chain of mountain ranges that runs down the spine of the province from the Yukon border to the American boundary, are among the most rugged and least accessible terrain in North America. The valleys are deep, the slopes are steep, and the old-growth forest in the lower elevations is among the densest and most structurally complex in the world, with a biomass per hectare that rivals tropical rainforest and an understory so thick that walking off-trail in many areas is essentially impossible. The archaeology of the BC interior ranges is, consequently, among the most incompletely documented in the country. What has been documented, in the areas where survey has been possible, is a pattern of pre-contact land use that is more intensive and more structurally complex than the standard model predicts. The Nlaka'pamux, Secwepemc, Silks, and other interior plateau nations of BC have oral traditions of landscape management that include references to constructed landscape features, fish weirs and game drives and root garden modifications, but also to features that do not fit into those practical categories. Features in the high mountain terrain that are described in oral tradition as places where the old knowledge was kept, places where specific kinds of ceremonial and observational work was done that required the specific character of the high terrain. A 2012 survey associated with a proposed run-of-river hydroelectric project in the Thompson River watershed documented a series of stone features on an exposed ridge crest above the project area. The features were described in the survey report as stone cairns and possible stone enclosures, ranging in size from small single stone markers to a larger arrangement of fitted stone that the surveyors estimated was 6 by 8 meters in extent. The larger arrangement showed evidence, in the surveyor's description, of deliberate wall construction, with stones fitted in courses and an interior space that was clear of the organic material covering the surrounding terrain. The Nlaka'pamux Nation was consulted during the survey, and their knowledge holders identified the ridge as a significant cultural landscape, a place associated with the training of traditional knowledge keepers and with the specific observational practices that Nlaka'pamux knowledge tradition requires of those who occupy ceremonial roles. The knowledge holders did not provide specific information about the constructed features, but their identification of the ridge as a training place is consistent with the location and character of the stone arrangement, which is in exactly the position, exposed ridge with long sightlines, that a training and observation facility would occupy. The project was modified to avoid the ridge area, and the features were assigned site numbers in the BC Archaeological Site Database. No further investigation has been conducted. That story, the project modification, and the site number, and the further investigation that has not occurred, is by now familiar from every region of Canada that this account has touched. It is the standard outcome for anomalous boreal and mountain forest stone features that are found in the context of development projects, found and protected in the minimal sense of not being physically destroyed, and then left in the database to wait. The waiting is not nothing. The site number is protection of a kind. The modification of the project is a real outcome, a real consequence of the initial documentation. But it is not understanding, and it is not investigation, and it leaves the feature in the condition that the boreal forest has always kept it in, known and not known, present and not studied. The Chilcotin Plateau, west of the Fraser River in central BC, is a high, cold, semi-arid plateau of open grassland and sparse pine forest that has a distinctive character, quite different from the dense boreal forest to the north and the coastal rainforest to the west. The Chilcotin people, whose traditional territory covers most of the plateau, have one of the most detailed and most carefully documented oral traditions of landscape knowledge in BC, in part because the Chilcotin Nation has been deeply engaged in land use documentation since the Supreme Court of Canada's Chilcotin Nation decision of 2014, which recognised Chilcotin Aboriginal title over a specific area of their traditional territory and required detailed documentation of traditional land use in support of ongoing negotiations. That documentation process has produced, as a byproduct, one of the most systematically assembled records of pre-contact landscape feature knowledge held by any BC First Nation, and among the features documented in the Chilcotin oral tradition are a number of stone constructions on the plateau that the knowledge holders identify as pre-contact and as not of Chilcotin construction. These features include stone walls on ridge crests, stone circles in valley floor locations, and a series of linear stone arrangements that run across the plateau in directions that the knowledge holders describe as ancient travel routes. The ancient travel routes of the Chilcotin Plateau are, in the Chilcotin oral tradition, not of Chilcotin origin. They are attributed to the time before, to a period of occupation that preceded the Chilcotin presence on the plateau. The linear stone arrangements that mark these routes are not roads in the sense of constructed surfaces, they are markers. Upright stones set at intervals to indicate the route through terrain where the route is not otherwise obvious. The spacing and the consistency of the marker style across the plateau, according to knowledge holders who have documented multiple sections of the route, suggest a single system rather than a set of independent local features. A single system, meaning a connected network of travel route markers extending across a plateau region, implies a level of landscape-scale organization and a degree of social coordination that challenges the standard model of pre-contact plateau peoples as small, mobile, mutually independent bands. A network of route markers, covering a significant area of terrain, is the product of a community or a confederation of communities that shared the network and that coordinated its construction and maintenance, because a route marker that no one maintains and no one repairs is a route marker that becomes invisible within a few generations, its upright stones toppled by frost or animal activity or simple time. The Chilcotin oral tradition says the markers are still there, in the places where the knowledge holders know to look, which means they have been maintained, either actively or because the terrain has been stable enough that they have not needed maintenance, across whatever span of time separates the current period from their construction. That is, again, the lichen argument and the tree argument applied to a different kind of feature. The feature's persistence is itself evidence of its antiquity, and its antiquity is a minimum bound on the sophistication of the social organization that produced it. The Chilcotin Nation has been working with archaeologists to ground truth the oral tradition about the plateau features, and partial surveys conducted as part of the land use documentation process have confirmed the presence of stone features in locations identified by knowledge holders, including sections of the linear route markers in 2 areas of the plateau. The surveys were conducted in parallel with the land use documentation rather than as a primary research objective, and their coverage is not systematic, but the correspondence between the oral tradition locations and the confirmed stone features is consistent enough to support the conclusion that the oral tradition is accurate geographical information about real features in the real pond. Landscape. What that means is that the Chilcotin Plateau contains the remnant of a landscape-scale route marking system of unknown age, constructed by people who are now remembered in Chilcotin oral tradition as the ones who were here before, and that this system is documented in oral tradition with enough specificity to allow ground truthing, and that the ground truthing confirms the oral tradition in those areas where it has been tested. That is a remarkable state of knowledge. It is the kind of state that, in an adequately resourced research environment, would immediately generate a systematic survey program, a dating program, and a formal study of the relationship between the oral tradition documentation and the physical evidence. The research program does not yet exist at the scale the evidence warrants, but the documentation that makes it possible is being built year by year through the Chilcotin land use process. The stone is in the plateau, the knowledge is in the community, the documentation is in the archive, the research is coming. That is the state of the whole question across the whole of the Canadian forest at this particular moment in the long, slow work of understanding what the landscape has been keeping. The stone is in the forest and the plateau and the mountain ridge and the tidal flat and the boreal bog and the shield summit. The knowledge is in the communities, held by the elders and the oral traditions and the land use documentation processes and the community-based research programs that are building the bridge between the community knowledge and the academic framework. The features are in the databases, numbered and referred for further study. The LiDAR data is accumulating. The wildfire surveys are producing the kind of blanket-lifting revelation that shows what has been under the forest all along. The partnership research programs are finding what neither community knowledge alone nor academic archaeology alone could find. And the picture is forming, slowly, imperfectly, against resistance and across gaps, and through the frustration of evidence that outruns the institutional capacity to process it. But forming, what the picture shows is a country that is older than the history it has been given, a landscape that has been shaped by human hands for longer than the standard account admits, a forest that is not wilderness in the sense of being uninhabited and unmodified, but that is wilderness in the sense of being free, wild, carrying its own knowledge and its own record and its own testimony to what has happened in it, independent of any institution's willingness to receive that testimony. The stone testifies, the oral tradition testifies, the lichen testifies in its slow grey way, the trees testify with their root systems wrapped around the fitted stone, the peat testifies with its depth, the landscape testifies with its names, the names that the communities have given to specific places over so many generations that the name is now older than the oldest written record, and that the name contains, if you know the language and the tradition, information about the place that no other source preserves. Listen to the testimony. It is speaking clearly, in stone and in oral tradition and in the field notes of the careful observers who wrote down what they found in neutral language because there was no other language for it. It is speaking of a deep past that is not empty, a deep past that was full of people and knowledge and construction and attention and care. It is speaking of builders who understood that what they built would outlast them and built accordingly. It is speaking of communities who kept the knowledge of what was built through everything because the knowledge was worth keeping. You have heard the testimony tonight. You have followed it from the Manitoba Forest Path to the Haida Gwaii Terraces, to the Quebec Inselberg summits, to the Yukon Ridge markers, to the New Brunswick upland enclosures, to the Saskatchewan Wildfire Corridor, to the Algonquin Highland summits, to the Georgian Bay stone circles, to the Chilcotin plateau route markers and beyond. You have followed the thread through a landscape that is 3,000 kilometers wide and that holds, in its forests and its rocky summits and its tidal flats and its high plateaus, the evidence of a civilization that the standard history has not yet found the vocabulary to name. It is late. The forest is dark. The stone is in the dark. And you are here, at the end of the long night, carrying the beginning of a different understanding of the country you are in and the depth of the human presence that preceded your own. That is not a small thing to carry. It is in fact the weight of what the stone has been waiting to give you, across whatever years separate you from the hands that placed it. The knowledge that you are not in fact the first. That the place you are in was known before you knew it, shaped before you arrived, inhabited in ways that left marks in the most durable medium available. Marks that are still there, in the dark of the forest, patient and present, and exactly where they were left. Sleep with that knowledge. Let it settle into the mind, the way the organic matter settles into the forest floor, quietly, without ceremony, finding its place in the accumulation that holds everything else, and resting there, and being there in the morning when you wake. The stone will be in the forest will be in the light, and somewhere between those two facts is the whole story, still being told, still being found, still being understood, by the researchers and the communities and the lichen and the years. Good night. There is no conclusion to a story this old and this unfinished. There is only the moment when you stop telling it for the night, and the forest goes on keeping what it keeps, and the stone goes on being what it is. And somewhere in the dark between the telling and the morning, the knowledge placed in the landscape by the people who are now only stone continues its quiet, patient, entirely unhurried work of waiting to be found. The work is real, the stone is real. The night is real. Rest now. The stone endures. Good night now.